Welcome to Tales from the Timeline on Thought Castle. In today's episode, we look back on the history of seafaring and maritime.
Hey everyone, and welcome to our deep dive, this time into the very beginnings of seafaring.
Oh yeah, this is going to be a good one.
It really is. We're going to be trying to answer the question of how did humans go from living on land to navigating the open ocean?
You know, it's a journey that goes back tens of thousands of years.
It really is.
And it's so interesting to think about human ingenuity and how our relationship with water has evolved over time.
Yeah, and we have some awesome research to go over. But I always start with the most basic question.
Of course.
How did people even come up with the idea to build boats in the first place?
Yeah.
Like, what would give them that idea? And then what were those very first boats even like?
Right.
And then once they had a boat, how do they figure out where to go?
Yeah. How'd they navigate?
I mean, no GPS back then?
Nope.
Not even a compass?
Yeah. It's really fascinating to think about, it wasn't like a sudden shift. It was this gradual process of innovation, and it was all driven by, survival and observation.
Basic needs.
Yeah. And a lot of bravery, too.
Yeah, definitely courage.
Yeah.
So our research suggests that it all really began with humans settling near water sources.
Makes sense.
Rivers, lakes, coastlines.
Yeah. You need water to survive.
Yeah,
So, water was and still is a crucial element for life.
for sure.
Imagine all the fish and shellfish you could get.
Right.
Fresh water. These were huge draws for our ancestors who, were struggling to survive on land.
And it's interesting, even today we're still drawn to coastal areas.
We are. There's something about being near water that just feels...
Right. It's
Oh.
like a primal connection.
Yeah, it is. And it's interesting because that proximity to water also, led them to see a whole world of new possibilities.
Right.
And they started observing things.
Like logs and driftwood floating down rivers,
Yeah.
carrying debris, maybe even animals.
Exactly. And they probably saw how those objects moved with the currents, and it made them realize, hey, things can float.
Right.
If a log can stay afloat.
Why not me?
Exactly. Why not something built by us?
And it's so cool to think about that shift from just watching to actually doing.
Yeah.
Going from like, oh, look, a floating log to, I wonder if I can make something float that can carry me.
And, it wouldn't have been easy.
Right.
It probably took a lot of trial and error.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Testing different materials, different designs. But, that's where we really see, the resilience and ingenuity of early humans.
They were figuring it out.
Yeah.
And eventually they did. They developed rafts.
Yeah.
Basically just logs or reeds tied together.
Bundles. Yeah.
And then a huge step forward.
Huge.
Dugout canoes carved right out of tree trunks.
Yeah. Now that changes everything.
Game changer.
We actually have archaeological evidence of this.
Yeah, too.
Some dugout canoes have been found that date back over 8,000 years.
That's wild.
I know. Imagine the skill and effort it took to make those.
With the tools they have.
Yeah, crazy, right?
So now we've got these early humans. They figured out how to build boats.
Mhm.
But to actually get in one and go out into the open water,
That takes guts.
that must have taken so much courage.
It does, to just set off into the unknown like that.
It's like a whole different world.
It is. It really is. Think about it psychologically.
Yeah.
Large bodies of water could have easily seemed like these massive, untamable forces.
Right.
And a lot of myths and stories from all different cultures depicted water as both life-giving and destructive.
Very interesting.
It shows how complex that relationship was.
Yeah, so do you think, what drove that first person
I don't know.
who was brave enough to push off from the shore
Yeah.
and head out into the open water? What were they thinking? What fears did they have to overcome?
Well, we can't know for sure, but it's safe to say that the promise of resources, finding new places to live, maybe even a sense of adventure,
Right.
those things must have outweighed the fear.
They were driven.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just rafts and canoes.
Right. Oh, God.
Our research talks about other really ingenious types of watercraft.
For sure. What about those inflated animal skins all tied together
Oh, yeah.
to make a floating platform?
Like a raft.
Yeah. Or boats woven from reeds.
Wow.
Even today,
Yeah.
the Uru people of Lake Titicaca still use reed boats.
That's amazing.
And the ancient Egyptians did too.
Wow.
So these were really resourceful solutions.
Yeah, but even if you've got a boat that's only half the battle,
Right.
the real challenge is figuring out how to navigate.
Yeah. How do you get around this massive amount of water?
Exactly.
And you can't see any landmarks.
How did they not just get constantly lost?
Well, they probably did sometimes.
Makes sense.
But they learned from that.
Right.
They adapted and they developed techniques.
So what did they do?
Well, the earliest navigators, they would stay close to the shore
Okay.
and use landmarks to guide them.
Okay, so like cliffs and trees and
Yeah, things like that.
rock formations.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so hugging the coastline was key.
It was. And they also probably used things like estuaries and river deltas and inlets as safe pathways.
So they could explore a bit further,
Yeah.
but still have a way back to familiar territory.
Exactly. Like when you're in a city
Yeah.
and you use landmarks to find your way around.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, but what about when they wanted to go further
Further.
out of sight of land?
Oh, that's when things get really interesting. They started looking up at the stars.
Celestial navigation.
Yes.
Using the sun, moon, and stars to guide them.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
I know. And it wasn't just looking randomly at the sky.
Right.
They learned to identify specific constellations.
Oh, wow.
And Polaris, the North Star, became a really important reference point in the Northern Hemisphere.
So they were basically creating the first star maps,
They were.
carrying all that knowledge in their minds.
Yeah, and passing it down through generations.
Wow, that's amazing.
And they didn't just stop there. They also paid close attention to the natural world around them,
Okay.
specifically the wind and water currents.
Because if you're out on the water, you need to understand those.
You do. You need to know how to move effectively.
Right.
So imagine those early mariners just watching how things floated in the water, how
Yeah.
the tides changed.
Right.
They started recognizing patterns, and it gave them a basic understanding of these powerful forces.
So they were figuring out how to work with nature.
They were decoding nature's language.
That's amazing.
It is. And even though it was rudimentary,
Yeah.
that knowledge laid the foundation for the more sophisticated oceanic navigation that came later.
It all starts somewhere.
It does.
So we've got the boats, we've got the navigation. But what about the voyages themselves? Like, where were
Yeah.
these early seafarers going?
Well, some of the earliest documented voyages were made by the Austronesian peoples.
Oh, yeah. I've heard of them.
They were amazing navigators.
Weren't they the ones who colonized all those remote islands in the Pacific?
Yes, they were.
Wow.
They used relatively simple canoes and rafts, and they colonized islands across huge distances.
That's
in
incredible.
both the Pacific and Indian Oceans.
Bro.
They were amazing.
And we can't forget about what might be the most incredible accomplishment in early seafaring.
What's that?
The first confirmed sea crossings to
Yeah.
Australia.
Oh.
And get this.
Right.
These crossings happened at least 50,000 years ago.
50,000 years.
I know. Can you imagine that?
It's hard to even picture.
Navigating by the stars across that much open water?
It's incredible. It really is. And as those settlements grew
Yeah.
and technology advanced,
Mm-hmm.
those voyages took on new purposes.
Oh, yeah?
It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was
Right.
about connecting with others,
Right.
trading and exchanging ideas.
Our research mentions these inter-island trade networks developing.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
As communities grew, they needed to find resources they didn't have locally.
Right.
And what better way than to sail to other islands and trade?
Exactly.
Obsidian, for example, is a volcanic glass.
Yeah.
It was really valuable for tools and weapons.
Right.
And it was traded across hundreds of miles of open water.
So those early voyages weren't just about exploring.
No.
They were driving the development of commerce
Yeah.
and the exchange of goods and even culture.
Exactly. And those early interactions were really the foundation for the more complex maritime civilizations
Yeah.
that we'll talk about in a bit.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So it's crazy to think that something as simple as wanting food or new resources
Yeah.
could lead to such a massive change in human history.
I know. It's amazing. And those journeys, they also sparked people's imaginations
Right.
and led to all these myths and legends.
The myths, I love that part of history.
Yeah.
So we're talking stories of sea gods and epic voyages, lost continents, all reflecting those early seafarers' experiences and fears.
Exactly. And these stories weren't just for entertainment.
Oh, really?
No, they were a way to preserve knowledge,
Okay.
to teach future generations about the dangers and wonders of the sea.
So they were warnings, but also celebrations of courage.
Exactly. They celebrated those who dared to venture out onto the open water.
I like that.
Yeah.
And those myths also contain some really valuable information
Oh, yeah.
about navigation.
Definitely.
You got to read the stars, understand currents, even predict the weather.
All woven into these really captivating narratives.
It's like oral history mixed with an adventure story.
It is. And they also reveal the psychological impact of seafaring.
How so?
Well, think about the stories of storm gods, sea monsters,
Right.
underwater realms. It reflects the very real dangers
Right.
that those early sailors faced and the deep respect they had for the ocean's power.
It's a good reminder that those early voyages weren't just about practical skills and navigation.
Yeah.
They were about pushing the boundaries of human experience,
Yeah.
confronting the unknown,
Yeah.
and shaping our understanding of the world.
Beautifully put. That's what makes those early days of seafaring so compelling. It's about our curiosity, our drive to explore, and our ability to overcome challenges.
Even when facing something as vast and powerful as the sea.
Exactly.
So from those first tentative steps onto the water, we see the beginnings of global exploration, trade, and cultural exchange.
We do.
It's truly a turning point in human history.
It is. The Phoenicians weren't the only ones who mastered the sea around the same time on the other side of the world. Ancient Egyptians were making their mark as skilled seafarers, navigating not only the Nile River, but also venturing out into the Red Sea and beyond.
I always picture the Egyptians with those beautiful barges just gracefully sailing along the Nile. But you're saying they were going further than that?
Oh, yeah, they were. They actually developed some really advanced shipbuilding techniques.
Really?
Yeah, they were constructing these large cargo ships that could carry tons of goods.
Wow.
Like grain, timber, even exotic animals.
Wow. So what was their main thing? Were they like the Phoenicians mostly focused on trade?
Trade was definitely a big part of it.
Oh,
They
wow.
established these really extensive trade routes
Okay.
with civilizations in the Middle East, Africa, and even the Indian subcontinent.
So they were going pretty far.
They were, and
Yeah.
they were bringing back things like incense spices, gold, ivory, all sorts of stuff that was highly prized in Egyptian society.
It's like they were already part of that lucrative spice trade that would later fuel so much exploration around the world.
Exactly. And it wasn't just trade either. They also used their naval power for, protecting their borders
Right.
and launching military expeditions.
That's right. Queen Hatshepsut's famous expedition to the land of Punt comes to mind.
Oh, that's a perfect example. That expedition, which happened around 1493 BCE, really shows just how ambitious and skilled the Egyptians were as seafarers.
Yeah, tell me about it.
I mean, they sailed all the way down the Red Sea,
Wow.
across the Gulf of Aden, and then along the coast of East Africa. We're talking over 1,500 miles.
That's a serious journey.
It is. And they came back with all sorts of treasures, like incense, ebony, ivory, gold, and even live myrrh trees, which were considered sacred in Egypt.
Wow. So it's like a diplomatic win and an economic win.
Exactly. It really solidified their position as a major power in the ancient world.
So the Egyptians were obviously key players in this maritime world.
Oh, yeah.
But what about other cultures in the Indian Ocean? Who else was out there exploring?
Well, the Indian Ocean was a really vibrant hub of
Yeah.
all these different cultures and maritime traditions.
Right.
And you had the Harappans.
The Harappan.
Yeah, an ancient civilization that was around in the Indus Valley
Okay.
from about 3,300 to 1,300 BCE.
So while all that stuff was happening in the Mediterranean
Yeah.
with the Minoans and the Mycenaeans and then the Phoenicians,
Right.
what was going on in the Indian Ocean around that same time?
Yeah, so the Harappans, they had these well-established trade networks that extended all the way to Mesopotamia and even Egypt,
Wow.
which tells us they were pretty accomplished seafarers.
So they were navigating these long and dangerous routes
Oh, yeah.
thousands of years ago.
They traded in things like cotton and textiles, precious gemstones, even seals that were engraved with their unique script.
So those seals are like evidence of their far-reaching connections.
Exactly. It's amazing to think about those ancient trade routes all across the Indian Ocean.
No, it's like connecting these civilizations that were so far apart.
It is, and that exchange of goods, ideas, and cultures really helped to shape the history of the region.
For sure. So we've got the Harappans in the west.
Right.
Who else was out there making waves?
Well, as we move east, we come to the Austronesians.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of them.
Yeah, a seafaring people who originated in what's now Taiwan and Southeast Asia.
Okay.
And they were famous for their epic voyages.
Wait, hold on. Weren't the Austronesians also the ones who colonized those remote Pacific islands like Hawaii and Easter Island?
That's them. They're considered some of the most skilled navigators in all of human history.
Yeah, I remember you were saying earlier.
Yeah, they use these really sophisticated techniques to navigate huge expanses of open water.
It's crazy to think about that.
Yeah.
They didn't have any modern instruments.
They didn't. They were masters of celestial navigation.
Wow.
They used the stars, the sun, and the moon to guide their voyages.
Wow.
And they developed this intricate understanding of wave patterns, wind directions, even the migration patterns of birds to help them find their way.
That's wild. It's like they could read the ocean.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They were so attuned to these subtle cues, like the color of the water, the presence of certain marine life, even the smell of distant islands.
The smell.
Yeah, crazy, right?
Yeah.
All of that contributed to their amazingly accurate navigation.
Their navigational skills are mind-boggling.
Okay.
So what kind of boats did they use for these epic voyages?
Well, they developed a variety of vessels, including outrigger canoes and double-hulled canoes, which were super stable and seaworthy.
Got it.
And they were often decorated with these intricate carvings and designs.
So they were works of art.
They were works of art and symbols of their cultural identity.
So cool. I can picture those canoes cutting through the waves, carrying these intrepid explorers to new horizons.
Yeah, it's an amazing image.
Yeah.
So what do you think motivated them to undertake such ambitious journeys?
I mean, it had to be a combination of things, right?
It was probably a mix of factors.
Okay.
Some theories suggest that maybe population growth or resource scarcity on some islands forced them to look for new territories.
Makes sense.
Others point to a spirit of adventure,
Right.
a thirst for exploration, or even the pursuit of trade opportunities.
So a mix of push and pull factor.
Yeah, exactly. Driving them to venture out into the unknown.
But they didn't just go and never come back, right?
No.
They actually established these complex trade networks,
They did.
connecting all these different islands
Yeah.
and exchanging all kinds of goods.
Exactly. They traded obsidian shells, spices, even domesticated plants and animals.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
It's amazing how they were able to keep those connections going across such huge distances.
Yeah. I know it speaks volumes about how interconnected the ancient world actually was. It really does. And their voyages, they left a lasting mark on the cultural landscape of both the Pacific and the Indian Ocean.
Wow.
They contributed to the spread of languages, customs, even genetic traits across vast areas of the globe.
It's like they were weaving together the story of humanity.
Exactly. So we've covered the Egyptians, the Harappans, and the Austronesians, all playing a part in this dynamic maritime world of the Indian Ocean.
But were there any other major players in that region?
Oh, yeah. As we move into the first millennium BCE, we see the rise of some really powerful empires in Southeast Asia, like the Srivijaya Empire and the Khmer Empire.
Okay, I'm ready to hear about these empires. What made them stand out in the maritime world?
Well, the Srivijaya Empire, which is around from the 7th to the 13th century CE, was what we call a thalassocracy.
Well, what ocracy?
A thalassocracy.
Okay.
It's a fancy word for an empire that's mostly based on sea power. They controlled key maritime choke points, like the Strait of Malacca, which gave them control over trade routes between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea.
So they were like the gatekeepers.
Exactly. They were the maritime gatekeepers of Southeast Asia.
I see. And that's how they got so powerful.
It was. Their strategic location let them build up wealth and power through trade. They could tax ships that were passing through and control the flow of valuable goods like spices, silks, and ceramics.
So they had it figured out. What about the Khmer Empire? What was their deal?
So the Khmer Empire was around from the 9th to the 15th centuries CE.
Okay.
And they were known for their amazing temples. Like Angkor Wat.
Yeah, beautiful.
But they also had a big presence on the sea.
They did?
They developed a strong navy, which meant they could control coastal areas and trade with their neighbors.
So not a full-on thalassocracy like the Srivijaya.
I know, not quite.
But still.
But they knew sea power was important. They used it to grow their influence and get resources.
Okay.
And that contributed to the already bustling maritime network in the Indian Ocean at the time.
It's amazing to think about all these different cultures.
It is.
Each with their own unique traditions and ambitions, all connected through this shared maritime world.
It really shows how interconnected human history is, especially during this time of early globalization. As we've seen, seafaring wasn't just about trade or conquest. It sparked the exchange of ideas, technologies, and cultural practices that shaped these civilizations.
It's a good reminder that the oceans aren't actually separating us. They're more like bridges, connecting humanity across continents and cultures.
Beautifully said. So now let's shift our focus to a whole different scale.
Okay.
The vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean.
Right. So we've explored the Mediterranean, all those amazing civilizations.
It's incredible.
And then we went over to the Indian Ocean. Now it's time for the Pacific Ocean.
Yeah, the big one.
A biggest and deepest.
It really is a different scale altogether.
It is.
Think about it. Tiny islands scattered across this huge expanse of water.
It's mind-boggling.
Yeah.
How did people even find them in the first place?
Right.
Let alone figure out how to sail between them.
Exactly. That's what makes the story of Pacific seafaring so amazing.
Definitely.
It required this incredible level of skill and courage.
Yeah, we can barely imagine it today.
I know. So where do you want to start?
Well, we've already touched on the Austronesians.
Right, those master navigators.
Who colonized islands all across the Pacific thousands of years ago.
Yeah.
They used those outrigger canoes and double-hulled canoes.
Uh-huh.
And they relied on the stars and the currents and even the birds
Yeah, they were amazing.
to find their way.
They were the pioneers.
Right.
They laid the groundwork for this incredible maritime culture in the Pacific.
So who else came along?
Well, let's talk about the Polynesian Triangle. It's this region that includes Hawaii, New Zealand, and Easter Island.
Ah, yes, the Polynesians.
Exactly.
Famous for their voyages and their culture.
Yeah, they were descendants of the Austronesians.
Okay.
They inherited those amazing seafaring skills
Right.
and adapted them to the challenges of the Pacific.
So they took that legacy of exploration even further.
They did. They developed these large double-hulled canoes called wakaulua. Yeah, in Hawaiian.
Okay.
And they could carry tons of people and supplies for long voyages.
Wow.
And they were so carefully crafted.
Really?
Yeah, with beautiful carvings and designs that reflected their beliefs and their connection to the sea.
Beautiful. I can just picture those canoes gliding over the waves,
It's an amazing image.
propelled by the wind and the strength of those Polynesian sailors. So what were they looking for?
Well, like the Austronesians, it was probably a lot of different things.
Right.
Maybe population pressure on some islands forced them to find new places to live.
Makes sense.
There's also evidence of trade networks
Okay.
between the Polynesian islands.
Right. So they were looking for economic opportunities too.
Yeah, exactly.
If you're on an island with limited resources,
Right.
you need to find ways to supplement them.
If you do.
What better way than to sail to other islands and trade?
Exactly. And it wasn't just about the stuff they were trading.
Right.
It was the ideas, the stories, the cultural practices.
Right. So they were really weaving together a tapestry
Yes.
of Polynesian culture across those islands.
And their navigational skills were essential to that.
Yeah. Tell me more about that. How did they do it?
They used a sophisticated system of celestial navigation.
So the stars, the moon, the sun.
To figure out their latitude and direction.
But how do they figure out longitude?
That's the tricky part.
It is?
They didn't have a precise method for that,
Okay.
but they had an amazing sense of direction
Really?
and an intimate knowledge of the ocean.
Wow.
They paid attention to things like the color of the water,
The color.
the temperature, the direction of the wind,
Mhm.
the types of marine life they saw.
So they were really reading the ocean.
They were sensing its patterns.
Incredible.
They also developed these intricate mental maps,
Really?
memorizing star positions, wave patterns, the locations of islands.
That's a lot to remember.
It is. And they passed all this knowledge down through
Yeah.
generations,
Right.
using songs, stories, and even navigational charts.
Charts.
Yeah, but made out of sticks and shells.
Wow, that's
I
amazing.
know. The depth of their knowledge is incredible.
It is. And all passed down orally.
And their voyages weren't just about the practical side of navigation.
Oh, really?
They were full of ritual and ceremony, too.
Interesting.
They believed the ocean was alive with spirits.
Okay.
So they would ask their gods for guidance and protection before they set sail.
Makes sense. When you're out there facing the vast ocean, you want to feel safe.
You do. Their beliefs really shaped their whole approach to seafaring.
Right.
It gave them this deep respect and reverence for the power of the ocean.
I like that. So what were some of their most remarkable voyages?
Well, their colonization of Hawaii is a great example. They sailed thousands of miles from the Marquesas Islands,
Wow.
navigating by the stars and using their knowledge of the ocean.
To find these tiny islands.
Yo, it's incredible, right?
What about Easter Island?
Easter Island. One of the most isolated places on Earth.
How did they even...
I know. The settlement of Easter Island, or Rapa Nui,
Nui.
as the indigenous people call it.
Okay.
It's one of the most amazing feats of exploration.
It is.
They probably sailed from the Gambier Islands, or the Marquesas,
Okay.
and they navigated for weeks
Leaks.
across open ocean to find this tiny little island.
That's just mind-blowing. It really changes how we think about what's possible.
It does. And their voyages weren't just about finding new land either.
No,
They also traded and exchanged goods,
Oh, right.
connecting islands across huge distances.
So these networks of communication and trade span the entire Pacific.
They did. And those connections were so important in shaping Polynesian culture, spreading ideas, technologies, even genetic lineages.
It's amazing how something as simple as a canoe
It is.
can have such a huge impact on human history.
It really is. The Polynesian voyages are an incredible example of human ingenuity,
Yeah,
adaptability, and our connection to the sea.
absolutely.
Uh-huh.
So we started with those very first rafts and canoes,
Yeah.
and we've traveled all the way to the sophisticated ships of the Mediterranean and the epic voyages of the Polynesians.
We're a journey.
It really shows how humans went from living on land to mastering the sea.
It's a story that spans thousands of years.
It does.
And it's a testament to our curiosity, our courage, and our fascination with the unknown.
And it's a story that's still inspiring us today,
It is.
reminding us of the power of exploration and the importance of cultural exchange.
Yeah. And the limitless potential of the human spirit.
Beautifully said. So as we wrap up our deep dive into the origins of seafaring,
Uh-huh.
I hope you'll walk away with a sense of wonder
I hope so.
and appreciation for those who dared to venture out onto the water
Yeah.
and shaped our world and connected us across continents.
Exactly. Those early seafarers, they changed everything.
That you did. Who knows what other maritime mysteries are out there waiting to be discovered?
Who knows?
Maybe we'll find out in a future deep dive. Until then, fair winds and following seas.
Fair winds and following seas.
Thanks for joining us on this epic voyage through the history of seafaring.
Ahoy there, listeners. Welcome aboard as we set sail for a deep dive into the world of classical seafaring.
Excellent to be here.
You know, when we think about the Greeks and Romans, we often picture those epic land battles and empires.
Right.
But their mastery of the seas was just as impressive, wouldn't you say? And that's what we're going to explore today. We'll be charting a course through some fascinating notes and excerpts, really diving deep into the innovations that allowed them to rule the waves.
It's easy to forget, just how vital the Mediterranean Sea was back then.
Oh, absolutely. It wasn't just some body of water.
No, not at all. It was more like, a bustling network. You could almost say the central hub connecting all these different cultures.
So like a maritime superhighway. Who were the big players cruising along this ancient route?
You had the Greeks, of course, and the Romans.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just them. Egyptians, Phoenicians, even later you see influences from Islamic civilizations.
Wow, a real mix. So it wasn't just trading goods back and forth, was it?
No, think of it more like a Mediterranean mosaic. All these different cultures exchanging ideas, technology, even their art. Really fascinating how all of that shaped these civilizations.
Now we all know the Greeks had those amazing myths about the sea, Poseidon, Odysseus, always larger-than-life characters, but I'm guessing their real maritime history is just as captivating.
Absolutely. The geography of the Aegean Sea, with its islands and natural harbors, almost naturally steered them toward the sea, wouldn't you say?
It makes sense. They weren't just trying to survive out there. They wanted to conquer it, master it.
Exactly.
And one of their key innovations in achieving that mastery was the trireme, right? I've heard it described as a technological marvel, not just a simple boat.
Oh, the trireme was a game changer. Imagine a warship, sleek and nimble, designed for speed and agility, with 3 tiers of oars.
3 tiers of oars. Wow. So they could really outmaneuver those bigger, clunkier ships they came up against.
Oh, absolutely. One of the most famous examples is the Battle of Salamis in 480 BCE.
Oh, yes. That's the one where the Greeks, facing a much larger Persian fleet, used their trireme's agility to lure the Persians into a narrow strait.
That's right. Their size became a liability. The triremes, much smaller, more agile, darted in and out, causing chaos.
A classic David versus Goliath story. What a brilliant display of naval strategy. This victory must have had huge implications for the Greeks.
Absolutely. Not only secured their independence, but also helped establish their dominance as a naval power.
So the Battle of Salamis really cemented that idea that naval power equals political influence.
Exactly.
Now, when I think of the Romans, I tend to picture those legions marching across land, not necessarily dominating the seas. Were they always a maritime powerhouse?
That's interesting. No, they weren't. Initially, they were very much a land-based power.
Really?
But their conflict with Carthage, the Punic Wars, well, that forced them to adapt. And they did it in a surprisingly pragmatic way.
Pragmatic. So you're saying they weren't too proud to borrow a few good ideas from their rivals?
Exactly. Their early fleets were actually based on designs taken from Carthaginian ships.
Clever.
They knew a good design when they saw one. But they weren't just copying, of course. They brought their own innovations to the table as well.
And I'm guessing their most famous innovation, the one that really made them stand out, was the Corvus. It sounds a bit ominous.
It was quite unique, that's for sure. Picture a long, pivoting bridge. It had a heavy spike at the end.
A spike? What was that for?
It was designed to latch onto enemy ships, like a giant crow's beak, hence the name Corvus, meaning raven in Latin.
Okay, so they had this bridge-like thing, but how did it actually work in battle? Sounds pretty brutal.
Well, the Romans excelled at land warfare, so they thought, why not bring those skills to sea? The Corvus allowed them to board enemy ships and basically turn the naval battle into a land battle.
So they turned sea battles into something their legionaries were already experts in. Incredibly clever, even if it does sound chaotic.
It was a decisive tactic that played to their strengths. But they weren't just about brute force. The Romans were incredible engineers. They built harbors, complex networks of lighthouses. Some of them, like the one in Alexandria, were considered wonders of the ancient world.
It's like they were building this maritime empire piece by piece with each engineering marvel, connecting land and sea in a way that few civilizations had done before.
It's a great way to put it. They created this sophisticated system that integrated their land and sea routes, allowed them to move goods and troops more efficiently across their vast empire. And the impact of these Roman innovations, well, it went far beyond their own time.
It's amazing to see how both the Greeks and Romans, in their own ways, shaped the course of maritime history. Their innovations weren't just about conquering the seas, but about understanding them, interacting with them in new and innovative ways.
Absolutely. And the legacy of their ingenuity. Well, that's something we'll explore further when we return for the next part of our deep dive.
Welcome back to our deep dive. We've been uncovering all these amazing classical maritime innovations, the ones that helped make the Greeks and Romans such powerful forces at sea. But I'm curious, what kind of impact did all of this have on, the world that came after them? Did these innovations just fade into history, or did they have a more lasting influence on seafaring?
Oh, their influence was definitely long-lasting. When we think of those explorers setting sail during the Age of Discovery.
Right, those daring voyages.
We often forget that they were really building on knowledge, techniques developed centuries earlier by the Greeks and the Romans.
That's an interesting connection. So you're saying explorers like Columbus, Magellan, their achievements were partly because of those earlier classical innovations. But how exactly did those ancient triremes or those Roman warships with that Corvus thing influence voyages that happen, centuries later?
Well, think of it like a ripple effect. Knowledge and skills passed down, refined over time. The Greeks, for instance, they were incredibly skilled shipbuilders.
Right, and navigators, too.
Exactly. Those skills didn't just vanish.
Yeah.
They were adapted. They were improved upon and passed down through generations.
Yeah.
So by the time the Age of Discovery came around, European shipbuilders, they were drawing on centuries of accumulated knowledge, much of it rooted in those classical techniques.
So you're saying the design of those iconic ships from the Age of Discovery, like the galleon, the carrack, they might have been influenced by the trireme? That's amazing.
Absolutely. And it goes beyond just shipbuilding, too. Remember those impressive networks of Roman harbors and lighthouses we talked about?
Oh, yeah. Those are incredible.
We established a model for maritime infrastructure, how to connect sea and land routes to facilitate trade, to make exploration possible. Those innovations in harbor design, navigational aids like lighthouses, they had a real lasting impact.
It seems like the Romans weren't just focused on conquest, but on creating a more interconnected world through these projects. Amazing to think some of those structures, or at least their influence, can still be seen today.
Precisely. And their influence extends even further. The classical world, you see, also played a crucial role in developing one of the most essential skills in maritime history: celestial navigation.
Celestial navigation? You mean using the stars to find your way at sea? That sounds incredibly complex. Were the Greeks and Romans really that advanced in astronomy and in navigation?
Oh, they were pioneers in this field. They understood that the stars, they weren't just points of light up there. They were a map, a guide for those who knew how to read them. Greek astronomers, they meticulously studied the stars, the planets, their movements. And Roman navigators, they took that knowledge and used it to find their way across the Mediterranean.
So you could say we can draw a direct line from those ancient stargazers to the development of tools like the compass and the sextant, which became so essential for those later voyages of exploration.
Exactly. The systematic study of the stars by those classical civilizations, it laid the groundwork, both intellectually and technically, for those later breakthroughs. They were the ones who unlocked the secrets of celestial navigation, paving the way for explorers to venture further and further from those known shores.
It's mind-boggling to think about the impact. They didn't just dominate their own time, they equipped future generations to explore the world in ways they never could have imagined.
And their legacy goes beyond just the practical side of seafaring, too.
Right.
The classical world also left us with this wealth of stories, myths, artistic representations.
Right, all capturing that human fascination with the sea.
Exactly.
We talked about Odysseus earlier, but there are so many other examples. Tales of sea gods, epic battles, stories about courage and resilience in the face of this vast, unpredictable force of nature.
These stories, they were passed down through generations, and they shaped how we view the sea, Celebrated the ingenuity and bravery of those who ventured onto the waves, but also served as warnings. Reminded us of the sea's power, those dangers for those who underestimated it.
So these stories weren't just entertainment. They reflected the real challenges and triumphs of seafaring back then, gave us a glimpse into how these civilizations viewed the sea, how they interacted with it.
Exactly. They captured that sense of awe, that fear, that respect that ancient mariners felt towards the sea. And these themes, they still resonate today. Even with all our modern technology, the sea still holds a certain mystique, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It sparks our imagination, makes us think about our place in the world. But those classical stories, they add another layer, a connection to those who came before us, those who built those ships, fought those battles, charted their courses by the stars.
And that connection to the past, well, it's important. Reminds us that we're part of a long line of people who have been drawn to the sea, challenged by it, inspired by it. It makes you wonder.
What does it make you wonder? Don't leave me hanging.
What innovations are happening right now that will shape the future of seafaring, just like the trireme and the corvus did all those centuries ago?
That's a great question. And it's one we'll tackle when we return for the final part of our deep dive.
Welcome back to our exploration of classical maritime innovations.
Yeah.
It really is amazing to see how those ancient advancements, by the Greeks and Romans, they laid the foundation for, well, so much of what came after them in seafaring. But now I think it's time for us to shift our focus a bit.
To the future.
Yeah, to the future. What do you think? What do you think the future holds for seafaring? What kind of innovations are on the horizon that might be just as revolutionary as the trireme or the corvus were back in their day?
Well, that is a fascinating question to consider, isn't it? If we look at the trends today, the advancements, it seems clear that the future of seafaring, it's going to be shaped by, really advanced technology, but also a growing awareness of that need for sustainability. So you're talking about a future where those high-tech solutions meet environmental responsibility. Are there any specific innovations that really stand out to you as potential game changers?
One area that I find really exciting is the development of autonomous shipping. So essentially, ships that can navigate and operate with minimal or even no human intervention.
Autonomous shipping, so like self-driving cars, but for ships. That sounds pretty futuristic. I mean, how far along are we in developing that kind of technology?
Oh, it's more advanced than you might think.
Yeah.
There are companies right now testing autonomous cargo ships, guided by these really sophisticated AI systems that can optimize routes, reduce human error, improve fuel efficiency.
That's incredible. So it really sounds like it could have a huge impact on the shipping industry, making it safer, less polluting. But what about the crews? I mean, won't this type of technology lead to job losses in the maritime sector?
Yeah, it's a valid concern for sure. And it's something we need to carefully consider. But it's important to remember that autonomous shipping, it doesn't necessarily mean getting rid of all human involvement. It's more likely to lead to a shift in the types of skills that are needed. So, instead of steering the ship seafarers, they might be involved in tasks like remote monitoring, data analysis, systems management.
So we might be moving from a world of captains and sailors to a world of maritime data analysts and systems engineers. It's like the evolution of seafaring is mirroring what we see in so many other industries, isn't it? It's definitely something to think about.
It is, and it raises a lot of interesting questions about the future of maritime work and training. But it's important to remember that this is just one aspect of the changes happening in the maritime world right now.
Are there any other exciting innovations that you'd like to highlight?
Well, alongside autonomous shipping, we're also seeing incredible progress in things like underwater exploration. We're developing these new technologies that allow us to go deeper, to stay longer, explore the ocean floor in much greater detail than ever before.
It's almost like we're opening up this whole new frontier, but right here on our own planet. And I imagine there's so much we can learn from studying the deep sea, especially as we face, challenges like climate change.
Absolutely. And speaking of climate change, another area where we're seeing amazing innovation is in harnessing the power of the ocean itself to generate renewable energy. Mm-hmm. So we're developing these technologies that can capture the energy of waves, of tides and currents. I mean, the ocean has this immense potential to provide, clean, sustainable energy for the future.
Wow, it sounds like the future of seafaring is full of possibilities. It's incredible to think that we might be on the cusp of this whole new era, one where we can use technology to explore the ocean depths, transport goods more efficiently, and even generate clean energy from the sea itself.
It's true. And as we move into this new era, I think it's crucial that we remember the lessons we've learned from those who came before us, right? The Greeks and Romans, with their ingenuity and their understanding of the power of the sea, they left us a legacy that continues to inspire us today.
It's a legacy of innovation, of exploration, and of respecting the power and the beauty of the ocean. And it's a legacy that we should carry forward, as we navigate the future of seafaring. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to encourage you, our listeners, to keep exploring, keep learning, keep imagining what the future of our relationship with the sea might hold. Because who knows what incredible discoveries await us out there in that vast expanse. One thing's for sure, the journey is just beginning.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Thank you for joining us on this fascinating exploration of classical maritime innovations and their impact on the world, both past and present. Until next time, fair winds and following seas.
All right, so how about those waterways in early civilization? We've got personal notes and excerpts from some pretty academic texts, it looks like.
Yeah.
But the fun part is we get to dig out the cool stuff for you guys. It's not all just, names and dates.
Right.
We're going to see how those ancient innovations still have an impact on us today. Think globalization, renewable energy. You might even learn something new about something as simple as a sail.
Yeah. I think what's so interesting is that, these early civilizations were clever, not just about being near the water, but actually using rivers and coastlines. Like, they were the first superhighways. Think Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley.
So they weren't just, thirsty for water.
No, not just thirsty. They were really in tune with the best way to move things around back then. Imagine trying to move tons of grain or lumber without those waterways.
Oh, man. Talk about pre-Amazon Prime delivery, right?
Exactly. Waterways were totally revolutionary. They cut down travel time, made things cheaper, and let them trade with way more people. It's like they were setting the stage for early globalization without even realizing it.
Yeah, like they invented the express lane centuries ago. But did they always get along on these highways? I mean, sharing's not always easy, is it?
You're right. There was definitely conflict and competition. But, what's fascinating is that these waterways also force them to interact, to trade, and sometimes even cooperate.
So more like a highway with some interesting rest stops along the way.
Exactly.
But I'm curious about how these ancient supply chains worked. Were we just talking full-blown Amazon Prime levels of sophistication?
Well, maybe not Prime level, but the seeds were definitely there.
Yeah.
Think about the Silk Road. It wasn't just one road. It was this massive network of routes that spanned continents. Goods would change hands multiple times, passing through all sorts of people, merchants, empires, each one adding their own markup and, expertise.
Wow.
It was surprisingly complex for its time.
Okay, so maybe no 2-day shipping guarantee, but still a pretty impressive glimpse into how connected the world already was back then. And speaking of connections, let's talk sails.
Oh.
They seem so simple, but I have a feeling there's more to the story. Do you think those early civilizations deliberately chose wind power, or was it just the most practical option at the time?
That's a great question. While we can't know for sure if they were thinking about sustainability the way we do today, choosing to use sails was undeniably a move towards renewable energy. But let's not forget it was driven by necessity, too. Manpower alone could only take them so far.
So they needed a more powerful engine. And a wind was right there.
Exactly. Sails changed the game.
Right.
They shifted sea travel from human power to wind power, allowing for bigger ships, heavier cargo, and way faster travel times. It's amazing to think the wind was basically fueling their economic expansion and exploration.
So they were going green centuries before it was cool.
In a way, yes. And the impact was huge. Those who mastered sail technology had a real edge. They could explore new lands, set up trade routes, and even project their power across huge distances.
So sails weren't just about catching a breeze.
Yeah.
They were shaping empires and global trade.
Absolutely. And it's even reflected in our push for renewable energy today.
That's true.
They understood the power of harnessing natural forces, and we're still working on that same challenge today, just on a much larger scale.
Okay, that's starting to feel like that aha moment we talked about.
Okay.
Even simple innovations can have a huge impact on history.
Precisely. And it makes you wonder what innovations today will have a similar impact centuries from now.
That's a great question. And we'll be diving into more of those impacts, including the cultural ones, right after this break. We'll be right back. Don't go anywhere. We're back and ready to keep going with how waterways shaped the ancient world. We've talked about rivers and how sails changed everything. But I gotta say, the real adventure starts out on the open ocean, right?
Yeah, you're right. Those vast expanses of water, they were both a challenge and an opportunity for those early civilizations. It's one thing to navigate a river,
Right.
but going across an ocean with no land in sight, that's a whole other story.
So how did they do it? Did they just point their ships and hope for the best?
No, they were incredibly skilled navigators. They had to use a whole bunch of techniques, like celestial navigation, understanding wind patterns, and knowing coastal landmarks. Imagine navigating by the stars, using constellations as your guideposts.
Wow, that's like their GPS was written in the sky.
Exactly. And let's not forget about their shipbuilding techniques. They were always trying new things, coming up with new designs and ways of building to make their ships seaworthy and good for trade.
Do you have any examples? I'm picturing those sleek Viking ships.
Oh, yeah, tons of examples.
Yeah.
Like the Egyptians, they were amazing at mortise and tenon joinery. You know, that technique using interlocking wooden joints to build strong hulls? And you mentioned the Vikings. They were famous for their clinker-built ships with overlapping planks that made them super flexible and strong in rough seas.
It's incredible that they could make such sophisticated ships without the tools we have today.
It really shows you how smart and skilled they were. And remember, they weren't just building ships to get around, they were creating vessels to carry tons of stuff sometimes over incredibly long distances.
So it was about what they brought back too, right? Spices, silks, precious metals, things that could change their societies.
Exactly. But it wasn't just about the stuff. They also brought back new ideas, new technologies, and new ways of seeing the world. Think about all the cultural exchange that happened when these traders met different civilizations.
It's like those ships were carrying the seeds of globalization.
In a way, they were. Think about it. Their voyages helped spread knowledge about shipbuilding, navigation, even astronomy. The exchange of ideas that came from maritime trade had a huge impact on how civilizations developed all over the world.
So it wasn't just about what they brought back in their ships, but also what they carried in their minds. The stories, the knowledge, the different cultures. That's really cool.
Yeah.
But I have to ask, what were those first encounters like? Was everyone happy to see these new traders?
Well, human history is never that simple. Some encounters were peaceful and helpful,
Sure.
while others were full of conflict and exploitation. We can't forget that the history of maritime trade has a dark side, too.
That's a good point. It's easy to romanticize exploration and trade, but we have to remember the complicated and sometimes negative parts of those interactions.
Absolutely. But even with the challenges, there's something inspiring about the human desire to connect with the rest of the world, to explore what we don't know, and to share ideas and cultures. It's part of who we are.
I totally agree. And makes you think about how those ancient voyages are still shaping our world today. We're still connected through global trade, cultural exchange, and even the technology that lets us explore the oceans.
Absolutely. The legacy of those early maritime civilizations is everywhere. And their story reminds us that we have a shared history, a shared responsibility to learn from the past, and a shared future to figure out together.
Okay, so we've seen how these ancient mariners were basically the original globalizers connecting the world through their voyages and trade. But there's one more piece to this puzzle, a question that really gets to the heart of what this deep dive is all about. We'll get to that right now.
Oh.
Okay, so we're back and ready to wrap things up on this deep dive into how waterways shape civilization. We've covered a lot of ground, haven't we? From rivers being those first superhighways to how sails revolutionized travel and trade and how those ancient mariners navigated the open ocean.
Yeah.
Talk about skill and ingenuity, right?
Yeah, it's been a pretty amazing journey. And it's so clear that waterways weren't just, background scenery. They were major players shaping economies, societies, even the whole course of history.
It really is wild when you think about it. But you mentioned a final question, something that brings all this ancient stuff into today's world, something about waterways of the future, right?
Yeah. Right. Exactly. If we think of those ancient waterways like some early version of the internet connecting people and ideas over huge distances, it makes you wonder, what are the big game-changing waterways of our future? What innovations will be just as transformative?
Okay, now I'm curious. Are we talking flying cars, teleportation, or something even crazier?
Maybe all of those and then some. Think about how fast things are changing with space travel, artificial intelligence, biotechnology. Who knows? We might be close to discoveries that could revolutionize how we get around, how we communicate, even how we understand the universe.
So that spirit of exploration and wanting to create something new, it's still alive and well today. We're still pushing limits, seeking new frontiers, connecting with the world in ways they couldn't have imagined.
Absolutely. And
so what lessons can we take from those ancient mariners as we face the unknown in the future?
I think they offer some great lessons. First, the importance of being curious and having the guts to explore the unknown. Second, the power of innovation and being willing to experiment with new ideas and technologies. And lastly, recognizing that we're all connected and that our actions have ripple effects way beyond our immediate world.
Those are some powerful lessons.
Yeah.
It reminds us that even though we're thousands of years apart, we share that same human spirit with those early explorers. We're still driven by that desire to connect, to learn to leave our mark on the world.
Absolutely. And just like those ancient mariners who had such a lasting impact on civilization, we have the opportunity to shape the future too through our choices and our actions.
So as you go about your day, remember those ancient mariners who dared to go beyond what they knew. Let their story inspire you to be curious, to seek out new perspectives, and to make the world a more connected and understanding place.
And who knows, maybe you'll even play a part in shaping those waterways of the future, creating new paths of connection and discovery for generations to come.
Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to set sail for the Mediterranean.
Oh, yeah.
A region that witnessed a dramatic shift in power after the fall of the Roman Empire.
Absolutely. And it's a fascinating period, I think.
Okay.
It really is marked by the rise of two remarkable maritime powers, the Byzantines and Islamic civilizations. And, they inherited this legacy of seafaring from the Greeks and the Romans.
Right.
But they didn't just copy the old playbook.
Yeah, that's what intrigued me.
Did they?
When I first started digging into this, these civilizations weren't just maintaining the status quo.
Yeah.
They were actively transforming maritime technology and strategy.
Transforming it, and those innovations had ripple effects across the globe, influencing trade, cultural exchange, and even setting the stage for the age of discovery centuries later.
Exactly. And our source material today is Chapter 4 of a text focused on this very transition.
Right.
The rise of new powers in the Mediterranean after the decline of Roman dominance. What's our mission for this deep dive?
Our goal is to understand how the Byzantines and Islamic civilizations harnessed maritime power.
Okay.
Not just for military might, but also to secure their realms, foster cultural exchange, and lay the groundwork for global navigation.
So we're going to uncover how a triangular sail adopted by Islamic shipwrights revolutionized sailing and helped establish long-distance trade networks.
Exactly.
And we'll explore the Byzantines' secret weapon, Greek fire.
Oh, yes.
A mysterious flammable substance that gave them a decisive edge in naval battles.
Very cool.
Buckle up, this is going to be a wild ride through history.
Indeed it is. To fully appreciate the impact of these civilizations, we need to first set the scene. Imagine the Mediterranean after the fall of Rome.
Right.
A power vacuum emerges, creating both challenges and opportunities for those who dared to seize them.
So essentially, the stage was set for new players to make their mark.
Right.
And into this dynamic environment stepped the Byzantine Empire.
Yeah.
The Eastern continuation of Rome.
Right.
They clung to those classical traditions.
Yes.
But weren't afraid to put their own spin on things. I was surprised to learn that Byzantine shipbuilders weren't just mimicking Roman designs. They were actually enhancing them.
You're right. They reinforced hulls and refined rigging techniques.
Wow.
Resulting in a navy that was both robust and efficient. Their capital, Constantinople, was a bustling hub of activity,
Okay.
and their navy acted as its shield and economic lifeline.
It's fascinating to think of them as the guardians of the East,
Yeah,
strategically controlling key sea lanes in the Aegean and Black Seas.
absolutely.
But while the Byzantines excelled in naval defense,
Right.
the Islamic caliphates emerged as a maritime force to be reckoned with in their own right.
Yes.
What struck me was the speed at which they grasped the importance of maritime dominance.
Their expansion was remarkably swift.
Yeah.
And they quickly understood that controlling the seas was crucial for both trade and projecting power. And they weren't just relying on brute force. Their adoption of the lateen sail, a triangular sail, proved to be a game changer.
I have to admit, when I first read about the lateen sail, I thought, a triangular sail? How revolutionary could that be?
Yeah.
But then I started digging deeper.
Oh, yeah.
Can you explain why this seemingly simple design change
Yeah.
had such a profound impact on maritime history?
It all boils down to maneuverability.
Okay.
The lateen sail allowed ships to sail closer to the wind,
Right.
making them much more versatile and efficient.
So instead of being at the mercy of the wind,
Yeah.
Islamic ships could actually harness it to their advantage.
That's right.
I can see how that would open up a whole new world of possibilities for navigation and trade.
Precisely. This innovation fueled the growth of vast trade networks,
Wow.
connecting the Arab world to India, Africa, and even beyond, facilitating a flourishing exchange of goods,
Right.
knowledge, and culture.
Yeah.
It's no exaggeration to say that the lateen sail was a pivotal step towards a more interconnected world.
So we're seeing a pattern here.
Yes.
Both the Byzantines and Islamic fleets were building upon classical knowledge
Yes.
while also pushing the boundaries of innovation.
Right.
They were synthesizing old and new to create something truly unique.
It's a testament to their ingenuity and adaptability.
Yeah.
This era wasn't just about practical advancements, though.
Okay.
Maritime themes permeated their art, literature, and scholarship, reflecting the deep cultural significance of the sea in their societies.
That's what really brings history to life for me.
Yeah.
It's not just about dates and battles.
Right.
It's about understanding how people lived what they valued
Absolutely.
and how those values shaped their world.
I agree.
And in this case, the sea was clearly more than just a strategic space. It was a source of inspiration, identity, and even spiritual meaning.
You've hit on a crucial point to understand the Byzantine and Islamic maritime legacy. We need to appreciate how deeply intertwined the sea was with their cultural fabric.
Right.
It wasn't just about practical matters. It was a reflection of their worldview, their beliefs, their aspirations, and that's what makes this era so compelling.
This has been an amazing start to our deep dive. We've already uncovered so much about the rise of these two maritime powers,
Yes.
their innovative spirit, and the cultural significance of the sea in their world.
Absolutely.
I'm eager to explore further,
Me too.
especially those fascinating details you mentioned earlier,
Yeah.
Greek fire and the impact of these innovations on global exploration.
I'm with you. There's so much more to uncover.
Yeah.
And I think you'll be surprised by just how far-reaching the legacy of these civilizations truly is.
Okay,
All right.
throw back. And I'm still reeling from those incredible insights about the lateen sail
Oh, yeah.
and the cultural significance of the sea
Yeah.
in Byzantine and Islamic societies.
Absolutely.
But we left off with a tantalizing question. How did these maritime innovations ultimately contribute to the age of discovery?
Right.
I mean, those are worlds apart, right?
You might think so.
Yeah.
But the connections are more profound than you might imagine.
Okay.
Remember how we talked about the synthesis of knowledge? Well, that wasn't limited to shipbuilding techniques.
Right.
It extended to navigation as well.
So they weren't just building better ships.
Right.
They were figuring out better ways to sail them
Yeah,
across vast distances.
exactly.
What kinds of navigational advancements are we talking about?
Sure.
Did they have compasses back then?
Well, the magnetic compass wouldn't become a common navigational tool in Europe until a bit later.
Okay.
But they were already refining techniques like celestial navigation, using the stars as their guide.
Wait, you're telling me they could navigate across oceans using the stars?
Yes.
That's
And
incredible.
with a highly skilled practice,
Yeah.
requiring knowledge of the constellations
Right.
and specialized tools. For example, Islamic scholars and navigators made significant advances in the development and use of the astrolabe.
Okay, now you're just using fancy words to make me feel like I'm back in a history lecture.
Oh.
What's an astrolabe?
Think of it as an ancient astronomical computer.
Okay.
It's a circular instrument
Uh-huh.
with various markings and rotating parts
Right.
that allowed sailors to measure the altitude of celestial bodies,
Okay.
primarily stars, above the horizon.
Right.
By comparing these measurements with star charts and tables,
Right.
they could determine their latitude.
So it's like a GPS powered by the stars.
Exactly.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
But wouldn't the adoption of these innovations by other cultures,
Yeah.
like the Europeans have taken time,
Sure.
how did that knowledge spread?
That's a great question. The spread of knowledge was a gradual process,
Okay.
facilitated by trade migration and even conquest. Think about the Mediterranean as a crossroads of cultures.
Okay.
It was a bustling hub of exchange
Right.
where ideas, technologies, and goods flowed between the East and the West.
So it wasn't just ships and goods being traded,
No.
but knowledge itself.
Right.
And that knowledge eventually found its way into the hands of European explorers
Exactly.
who would later set sail for the New World.
Those daring voyages of exploration, those expeditions into uncharted waters,
Yeah.
were made possible in part by the groundwork laid by the Byzantines
Right.
and Islamic seafarers centuries earlier.
Okay.
Without their innovations in shipbuilding, navigation, and
Yeah.
cartography,
Right.
who knows how differently history might have unfolded.
That's mind-blowing.
Mm.
So it's not just about those ancient civilizations.
Yeah.
It's about the interconnectedness of history,
Yeah.
how one era builds upon another.
Exactly.
But let's be honest, not all of these interactions were peaceful.
Of course not.
Didn't the Byzantines and Islamic caliphates also clash at sea?
Of course, it would be naive to think this was all about collaboration
Right.
and knowledge sharing. They were rival powers, vying for control of trade routes, territory, and resources.
Right.
That competition inevitably led to conflicts,
Right.
some of them quite fierce.
So amidst all this innovation and cultural exchange,
Yes.
there was also a struggle for power playing out on the waves.
Absolutely.
It reminds us that history isn't always a neat and tidy narrative of progress.
Right.
It's messy,
Yes.
it's complex,
Uh-huh.
and it's often shaped by conflict,
Absolutely.
as much as by cooperation.
Precisely. And understanding this complexity is key to appreciating the full impact
Yeah.
of this period on the world we live in today.
Yeah.
We see the legacy of these civilizations, not only in the advancements they made,
Right.
but also in the geopolitical dynamics they helped shape.
You know, we've talked a lot about shipbuilding and navigation.
Yeah.
But I can't move on without discussing that Byzantine secret weapon,
Okay.
Greek fire.
Right.
It sounds almost mythical.
It does.
What exactly was it?
Yeah.
And how did it work?
Greek fire is one of those historical enigmas that continues to fascinate us.
Right.
Its exact composition remains a mystery lost to time.
Okay.
But we know it was a highly flammable substance,
Yeah.
likely a mixture of ingredients like oil resin
Uh-huh.
and perhaps sulfur.
So a kind of ancient napalm?
It's a tempting comparison,
Yeah.
though the precise formula and delivery mechanisms were different.
Okay.
Byzantine engineers devised ingenious ways to deploy this weapon,
Right.
often using pressurized siphons mounted on ships
Yeah.
to launch streams of burning liquid at enemy vessels.
Can't even imagine the terror of facing that on the open sea.
I know.
It's like something straight out of a fantasy novel.
Right.
No wonder it gave them such a decisive advantage in naval battles.
Imagine the psychological impact, too.
Yeah.
Facing a weapon that seemed to defy the elements,
All right.
a fire that couldn't be extinguished by water.
Wow.
It must have been terrifying.
It's no wonder they were able to defend Constantinople
Right.
against numerous sieges and attacks.
Exactly.
Greek fire played a crucial role in preserving their empire for centuries.
It did.
But while Greek fire was a Byzantine innovation,
Yeah.
we shouldn't overlook the advancements made by Islamic scholars and navigators
Right.
in cartography.
Absolutely.
They produced remarkably detailed maps and navigational charts,
Yes.
pushing the boundaries of what was known about the world.
Their maps incorporated information from various sources, including travelers' accounts, astronomical observations,
Right.
and even ancient Greek and Roman texts.
Wow.
These maps weren't just tools for navigation, they
No.
were reflections of their expanding worldview, their thirst for knowledge, and their growing understanding of the interconnectedness of the world.
So we've got innovative ship designs,
Yes.
celestial navigation, a flourishing network of trade routes,
Uh-huh.
maps that expanded the boundaries of human knowledge.
Right.
Anything else we should add to the list?
Well, I think it's important to emphasize that these weren't just isolated achievements.
Okay.
What made this period so remarkable was the way knowledge flowed and evolved through contact and exchange.
Right.
The Byzantines and Islamic civilizations weren't simply borrowing from each other or from their classical predecessors.
Right.
They were actively synthesizing and refining those ideas,
Okay.
creating a dynamic fusion of knowledge that propelled maritime technology and exploration forward.
So this era wasn't just about individual innovations,
No.
but about a larger process of cultural exchange
Right.
and intellectual ferment.
Mm-hmm.
It's fascinating to think about how interconnected the world was becoming,
Yeah.
even back then.
It really is.
But I have a feeling there's even more to this story.
Oh, there's always more.
What other surprises await us as we delve deeper into this fascinating period of maritime history?
Oh, there are always more surprises when you delve into the past, and that's what makes history so captivating. It's an ongoing journey of discovery, and there's always more to learn, more connections to make, and more insights to uncover.
Welcome back. We've been on quite a voyage, tracing the maritime legacy of the Byzantine and Islamic civilizations, from secret weapons to star-powered navigation.
It has been a whirlwind, hasn't it?
It's been incredible.
Yeah.
But as we wrap up our deep dive, I'm curious about the bigger picture.
Yeah.
What's the lasting significance of all this?
Right.
Why should we, in the 21st century, care about the maritime adventures of empires long gone?
That's a good question. I think the answer lies in understanding how these civilizations demonstrate the enduring human capacity for adaptation and synthesis.
Okay.
You know, they faced a changing world just as we do today, and their response was to innovate, to learn from the past, and to create something new.
So it's not just about ships and sails, but
Yeah.
about the timeless human drive to explore, to push boundaries, and to create a better future.
Precisely. And that spirit of innovation, that willingness to embrace change and adapt to new circumstances, is a lesson that's more relevant than ever in our rapidly evolving world.
Yeah, that makes sense. But I'm also wondering about the more tangible connections to our world today. Can you give us some specific examples of how this legacy continues to influence us?
Certainly think about modern shipbuilding. While the ships we see today are vastly different from those ancient vessels, many of the basic principles of hull design and rigging systems still have roots in those earlier innovations.
No.
And even though we now have GPS technology, celestial navigation remains a valuable skill taught to sailors and even astronauts.
Huh. It's incredible to think that those ancient seafarers are still guiding us, in a way, even centuries later.
And let's not forget the broader impact on globalization. Those early trade networks facilitated by maritime innovations laid the groundwork for the interconnected world we live in today. The exchange of goods, ideas, and cultures across vast distances began in earnest during this period.
So the next time I order something from across the globe, or video chat with a friend in another country, I should give a nod to those Byzantine and Islamic sailors who paved the way.
Indeed, their legacy lives on in countless ways, shaping the fabric of our modern world, from the technologies we use to the global connections we take for granted.
This deep dive has been a real eye-opener. I knew the Byzantines and Islamic civilizations were significant, but I never fully grasped the extent of their maritime impact. They truly were pioneers, shaping the course of history in ways that continue to resonate today.
It's a testament to their ingenuity, their adaptability, and their enduring legacy, and it's a reminder that history is not just a collection of stories from the past.
Right.
It's a source of inspiration, insight, and even guidance as we navigate the challenges of the 21st century.
So as we conclude this episode, I want to leave our listeners with a thought to ponder. We've seen how these civilizations blended the old and the new to achieve remarkable things. How might similar processes of adaptation and innovation be shaping maritime technology and global trade today? What can we learn from their successes and failures as we face the challenges of our own time?
These are important questions. History isn't just about the past, it's about understanding ourselves, our world, and the possibilities that lie ahead. And as we've seen today, the legacy of innovation and cultural exchange can inspire us to create a future that's both connected and sustainable.
Thanks for joining us on this maritime adventure. Keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep into the fascinating world of history. Until next time, fair winds and following seas. Welcome, everyone. Ready to dive into the world of Vikings?
Always ready.
Awesome. Well, we've got a ton of listener questions about longships.
Ah, yes. The heart of Viking exploration.
Exactly. So we're going to dig into Chapter 5 from this book, Painted Text.
Northern Horizons, the Viking Age, and Northern European Seafaring. A classic.
You know it. And honestly, the stuff in here, it's like Vikings were centuries ahead.
Oh, absolutely. They're shipbuilding, light years ahead of their time.
Right. Everyone pictures Vikings as these, fierce warriors, which they were.
Of course, of course.
But their ships, they were more than just warships. Like, they were technological marvels.
It's amazing how much we can learn just from studying those ships. Yeah, they were definitely more than just vessels for raiding.
That's what's so fascinating to me. These ships, they let Vikings explore, trade, exchange cultures. Like, did the longships help them be more than just raiders?
I think so. I mean, take the clinker construction they used.
Clinker construction.
Yeah, overlapping planks, fastened with iron rivets, made the hull super strong, for the rough North Atlantic, but flexible enough for rivers and shallows.
Whoa, so it was like tough A&D graceful.
Exactly. They could navigate all sorts of waterways, way more than just the open ocean, opened up a ton of possibilities.
So adaptable design, check. What about that sleek, streamlined shape we always see? That wasn't just for looks, right?
Oh, definitely not. That design, it let them cut through water like nobody's business. They could hit like 20 knots, which when you're reading or escaping, crucial.
Can you imagine like rowing for days and then needing to make a quick getaway?
Intense. And speaking of rowing for days.
Yeah, wouldn't that be exhausting?
Absolutely brutal. But that's where their dual propulsion system comes in. Oars for speed, maneuverability in tight spots.
I see.
But they also had that big square sail to catch the wind for long hauls. Efficient.
So switching between rowing and sailing, pretty smart. So did all this let them get beyond Scandinavia with the exploration and settlements and all?
Oh, absolutely. Iceland, Greenland, even North America, they had settlements in all those places. Their voyages, they linked the British Isles all the way to the Caspian Sea. Trade, cultural exchange, the works.
Wow. So much more than raiding then. They were skilled explorers, traders, venturing across huge distances.
And don't forget their navigation. No compasses, no GPS back then, but they were figuring out how to get across the open ocean.
How is that even possible?
Stars, the sun, they even used the flight patterns of seabirds and a deep, deep knowledge of weather.
Like they were human GPS systems.
Pretty much. Incredible skill and knowledge. Makes you wonder, right? What LSC did they accomplish that we haven't discovered yet?
That's a mind-blowing thought. But for now, let's maybe shift gears a bit. What about the cultural impact of their legacy in maritime history? I mean, the Vikings, their influence, it went way beyond just those voyages, right? So what kind of mark did they leave?
Well, their settlements, they caused this big blending of cultures, language, art, customs in so many regions. Look at Dublin, for instance. Originally a Viking settlement, became a huge trading hub. Norse and Gaelic cultures mixing.
Wow, so not just conquerors, but cultural ambassadors too, in a way. Did it go beyond culture, though?
Oh, yeah. Their longship designs, they influenced European shipbuilding for centuries after. The clinker method, those efficient hull designs, they set the bar for durability and speed.
It's crazy how Vikings, often portrayed as these figures of destruction, actually had such a huge role in shaping, well, everything.
It's true, but we can't ignore their reputation as warriors. The longship, for all its advancements, it was a tool of warfare, too. We got to acknowledge that.
Yeah, no sugarcoating it. Those longships, they weren't always on peaceful voyages. They had a fiercer side.
Exactly. That speed, their agility in the water, the shallow draft, perfect for raids. Strike fast, disappear just as quickly.
It's like a fandom. I guess that image of Viking raiders, hitting coastal settlement is pretty ingrained in our minds. And the longship, it's a big part of that.
Definitely. And I think that's kind of a powerful point, isn't it? Technology, even the most advanced stuff, it can have two sides, used for progress, but also for conflict. The longship, it embodies that duality.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And to understand the Viking Age, we have to understand that duality too. They were innovators, A&D conquerors, explorers, ADD raiders. Okay, so it wasn't just raiding and exploring. We talked about the design, cultural impact, their role in shaping history.
Yeah.
But those amazing navigation skills.
Yeah.
How were they actually doing that without, any of the modern tools we have?
Now that is where things get really interesting. Let's unpack how they managed to navigate the seas using just the world around them.
Okay, so Viking navigation. No compass, no maps, crossing oceans. How?
It's mind-blowing, right? They basically had this natural GPS system.
Yeah.
Observation, astronomy, generations of knowledge all combined.
So, reading the environment, letting nature be their guide. How did that work?
Well, they were masters of the stars, knew the constellations, their movements, how they related to seasons, location. The stars were their map.
Wow. Navigating by the stars. That's almost poetic. Did they have any tools to help them, like actual tools?
They did. One's particularly cool, the sunstone.
Sunstone.
It's thought to be this type of crystal could help them find the sun, even on cloudy days.
Wait, a crystal? How could that?
Pretty ingenious, actually. The exact method's still debated, but some scientists think they could polarize light, detect the sun's direction even behind clouds.
So even without seeing the sun directly, they knew where it was. That's wild. But what about at night? Or like in storms, could they still navigate?
That's where their knowledge of the sea, the wind, all that came in. They were experts at reading subtle cues. Wind direction, waves, bird flight, all gave them info.
It's like a sixth sense for the sea, almost.
Yeah, and that intuition was honed over generations. Viking seafaring knowledge was passed down through stories, sagas, experience. Each voyage, they learned more.
Speaking of sagas, I love those stories. So epic. But are they reliable, historically? Can we tell what's fact and what's, exaggerated?
That's the question, right? While we can't take them literally, they give us clues about Viking culture, their beliefs, how they did things. Courage, seamanship, respect for the sea's power, all big themes.
So more about understanding their mindset, their values.
Exactly. The sagas, even with the embellishments, show us how Vikings saw the world. Like, many highlight the dangers of the North Atlantic, then celebrate successful voyages. It was their way of preserving history, passing down values, knowledge.
Storytelling, so important for them. Entertainment and education. Each saga is a piece of the puzzle. But if they were so good at navigating, why did some voyages fail? I mean, they must have.
Even the best sailors can get caught out. The sea's unpredictable. Storms, rogue waves, hidden reefs could sink even the strongest longship. Nature's powerful.
So with all their skill, they were still at nature's mercy.
Oh, yeah. And don't forget human error, miscalculations, bad equipment, plain bad luck. Those things happened.
Exploration. Even when you're prepared, it's always a risk. But they achieved some amazing things.
No doubt. That willingness to push boundaries, go into the unknown, it's inspiring. Their legacy, it's not just about exploration, but innovation, challenging ourselves.
So, while longships themselves are gone, that spirit of adventure, of resilience, it's still with us. We've covered a lot. The ships, navigation, the sagas. But before we wrap up, I'm curious. What about everyday life on board? What was it actually like to travel on a longship for weeks, months at a time?
That's a great point. It goes beyond that romanticized image, right? Life on a long ship, it was tough.
So let's step on board. Imagine what it was really like to experience life at sea as a Viking. So I was thinking about those long voyages, weeks or even months at sea. What was the food like? Did they just eat dried fish and hardtack the whole time?
It's easy to imagine that, right? Subsisting on just preserved food. But while they did carry dried fish, meats, hardtack, for those long hauls, they also took advantage of opportunities along the way.
Oh, so they weren't just stuck with rations.
Nope. They were amazing fishermen and hunters, right? So fishing while at sea, hunting when they landed, fresh meat and fish. Way better than those preserved rations.
Keeps things interesting. What about drinks? They weren't sipping seawater, were they?
No way. Fresh water in barrels, of course. But they also had this other trick. They brewed ale.
Ale. On a ship. Isn't that, tricky to make and store?
Seems weird, but ale was actually safer than water back then. Brewing helped purify it, so less chance of getting sick. Plus, extra calories, nutrients for the crew.
So ale, not just a drink, but, essential. They had to be so resourceful, huh? Speaking of which, what was it like to actually live on a long ship? I mean, weren't they pretty cramped?
Yeah, longships weren't built for luxury cruises, that's for sure. Speed and efficiency over comfort. Crews slept on deck under wool blankets or animal skins huddled together for warmth.
Brr. Okay, no fancy cabins then. Sounds rough. Did everyone row and sail, or were there, assigned jobs?
Oh, there was a hierarchy on board for sure. The captain, or steersman, they were in charge of navigation, decisions, the whole shebang. Then you had skilled oarsmen, a sailmaster. Everyone had their role.
Real teamwork. But what about downtime? When they weren't rowing, sailing, or fishing, what did they do?
Boredom. It was a big challenge. They'd tell stories, sing songs, play games, even carve wood.
Keeping busy. Sounds like a tight-knit group, facing all that together. But it wasn't all hardship, right? They did build settlements, spread their culture.
Right. Those longships, they weren't just about war or exploration. They were, in a way, vessels of cultural exchange, too. Wherever they settled, they brought their customs, traditions, beliefs, influencing the people they encountered.
So these ships, they're more than just transport. They're tools that shape history, connecting cultures, leaving a mark on the world, And they did it all without any of the tech WE rely on.
Exactly. It speaks to their ingenuity, their resilience. They understood the natural world, worked with it. It's a reminder that even without fancy gadgets, we humans can do extraordinary things.
Absolutely. Their legacy, it's a push for us to look to nature, learn from it, push our own OBM boundaries. Well, I think we've reached the end of our journey on the Viking longship. We've seen the design, the role in exploration, trade, even gotten a taste of life on board.
It's been quite the deep dive, hasn't it? The ships, they were more than just vessels. They were symbols of a culture that embraced the unknown.
And as we step back onto dry land, let's take that Viking spirit with us, that thirst for adventure, that resilience, the belief in what humans can achieve. Until next time, explorers, may your own journeys be full of discovery and wonder. All right, so let's dive into the age of discovery. You know, all those stories about explorers and uncharted waters, super romantic, right? But have you ever thought about, like, the technology that made those voyages possible?
It's true. We don't always think about that, do we? The real groundwork for those famous ships and expeditions, it actually started centuries earlier, back in the medieval period.
Okay, so we're talking like castles and knights era, but with, like, cutting-edge ships.
Exactly. Most people miss that part. The medieval period was bubbling with maritime innovation. It's pretty amazing when you dig into it.
Okay, so less jousting, more shipbuilding.
Yeah.
Do it. So for this deep dive, we're going to go underwater. Well, figuratively, of course. To uncover those kind of overlooked innovations. And get this, we're looking at two parallel stories here. What was happening in Europe, and at the same time, what was going on in China.
Yeah, and what's fascinating is how these two maritime worlds, completely separate at the time, ended up influencing each other. And the crazy part is that those innovations, they still have ripples today.
Okay, I'm hooked. Let's start with Europe. I guess we've all heard of, like, cogs and caravels. But what made them so special?
Well, European shipbuilding had a major turning point, a real game changer. It's when they switched from clinker-built to Carvel construction.
Clinker-built, Carvel construction. Those are
Sure.
some interesting terms. What's the difference?
So imagine, right, you're trying to build an empire, but your ships, they're basically glorified rowboats.
Okay, not ideal.
That was Europe before this shift. With Carvel construction, though, it's different. The hull planks, they were laid edge to edge, so the hull, it becomes smoother, stronger, way more spacious, like night and day.
So bigger boats, more cargo, better stability in those rough seas. So this was, like, key for Europe's rise to power at sea.
It's no coincidence that this shift in shipbuilding, it happened at the same time as Europe's expanding trade routes and, their dominance at sea. Carvel construction, it allowed them to build ships that were not only larger, but, and this is important, capable of carrying heavy cannons.
Okay, yeah, that changes things, doesn't it? For naval warfare, I mean...
Huge game changer.
Okay, so that's the hull. But what about the sails? Weren't there some innovations there, too?
Ah, yes. The lateen sail. No, this actually originated in the Arab world. It's this triangular sail that allowed ships to finally sail closer to the wind.
Oh, wow, I never thought about that. Before this, you were basically stuck, right? At the mercy of the wind, only able to go in one direction.
Pretty much. But with the lateen sail, it was like suddenly unlocking, the ability to harness the wind. European sailors, they could navigate much more efficiently, explore new territories. It opened up a whole world of possibilities.
So being able to sail against the wind, that was super crucial for exploration then.
Absolutely. Plus, they were starting to use compasses and astrolabes more and more. It's basically a medieval GPS, using the stars.
Navigating across an ocean without GPS, I can't even imagine. That took some serious guts.
You're telling me. It took incredible ingenuity, too. They had to be incredibly skilled.
Okay, so while Europe was busy mastering the wind, China was taking a completely different approach, right? More focus on strength and stability. What can you tell us about the Chinese junk?
Ah, yes, the Chinese junk. It was a masterpiece of shipbuilding. Even if the name doesn't exactly, scream powerful vessel.
The junk, yeah, not exactly the most glamorous name. Sounds more like something you'd find washed up on a beach, not sailing across the Indian Ocean.
Well, don't let the name fool you. It had a unique design philosophy. It differed significantly from European ships.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So tell me more about this junk. What made its design so special?
Well, for starters, there's the junk rig. This thing was incredibly versatile. You could adjust the sails precisely to optimize like wind capture, almost like fine-tuning a race car.
Interesting. And what about the hull? What made it different?
The hull, it was pure genius. They had this compartmentalized design with watertight bulkhead.
Compartmentals, you mean like even if one section was damaged, the whole ship wouldn't go down?
Exactly. It was an early form of damage control, you could say. It significantly increased the junk's resilience at sea. They found some junks that were, get this, over 200 feet long.
200 feet.
Mhm.
Seriously, that's longer than a football field. It makes you realize the scale of these expeditions, right? It's mind-blowing. And speaking of pushing boundaries, we can't forget about the legendary Zheng He expeditions. Those were incredible feats of seafaring.
Oh, absolutely. In the early 15th century, this Admiral Zheng he led massive fleets of these junks across the Indian Ocean. I mean, we're talking reaching as far as Africa and the Middle East.
Wow. So at this point, European explorers were still mostly hugging the coastlines, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
So what was the purpose of these Chinese expeditions? Were they, about conquest, like a lot of the European voyages?
That's what's interesting. No, not really. Zheng He's voyages, they were primarily diplomatic and commercial, more about establishing trade links.
So showing off their power and technology, and you said fostering cultural exchange.
Exactly. It was a very different approach compared to the Europeans, who were often driven by, a desire for land or resources.
So the Europeans driven by exploration, trade, and sometimes conquest. And the Chinese are focused on diplomacy, trade, and cultural exchange. It's a fascinating contrast.
It really highlights the diverse motivations behind maritime expansion during this period. Different goals, different approaches, but both leaving a lasting impact on the world.
It makes you wonder how those different approaches might have shaped the course of history, doesn't it? But let's get back to Zheng He. What do his expeditions tell us about Chinese capabilities at that time?
Well, they tell us that the Chinese had mastered shipbuilding, navigation, logistics. I mean, think about it. These fleets, they had hundreds of ships, tens of thousands of crew members.
Wow, that's a logistical nightmare even today, let alone in the 15th century.
It really speaks volumes about their organizational skills, their maritime expertise.
And their navigation skills.
Mhm.
How do they manage to navigate across such vast distances?
They relied heavily on celestial navigation, using the stars to guide their course. They also had incredibly detailed maritime charts, which accurately depicted ocean currents and wind patterns. These were not just voyages of exploration, they were voyages of scientific discovery as well.
So we have these two maritime powerhouses, each with their own unique strengths and approaches. Europe with its innovative hull designs and wind harnessing sails. China with its massive junks and mastery of celestial navigation. But did the paths ever cross? Did these two worlds ever collide?
That's where things get really interesting.
So these two maritime worlds, Europe and China, both making huge strides in shipbuilding and navigation. But it sounds like they were doing their own thing, on opposite sides of the planet. Did they ever actually, connect?
That's the thing. It might seem like they developed in isolation, but there was actually a surprising amount of exchange happening between them, culturally and technologically.
Wait, are you saying there was, actual contact
Yeah.
between Europe and China way back in the medieval period?
Remember those vast trade routes we talked about? Those weren't just about silk and spices. They were like the internet of the medieval world. Ideas, technology, even religious beliefs, they were all flowing along those routes.
Okay, that's kind of blowing my mind. So what kind of exchanges actually happened? Did they, swap ship blueprints or something?
Well, think about the Leyteen sail, remember? That game changer for European ships. It actually originated in Asia and made its way west through those trade networks.
Oh, that's right. It's crazy how a simple sail design could travel across continents and, revolutionize seafaring.
Yeah.
Were there any other big tech transfers?
There's some evidence suggesting that Chinese shipbuilding techniques might have influenced European designs later on, especially those watertight compartments in their hulls.
Makes sense, right? If you see a good idea, why not borrow it? It's like open source shipbuilding, centuries before the internet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just about, sails and hull designs. It was the flow of ideas, knowledge, back and forth.
So these medieval innovations weren't just about, bigger and better boats. They were actually the seeds of globalization itself.
Exactly. Connecting different parts of the world, shaping the course of history.
That's pretty heavy stuff when you think about it.
It is. And it wasn't just about shipbuilding and navigation. Artistic styles, religious beliefs, scientific knowledge, all of this was flowing through these maritime channels.
It's mind-blowing to think of these medieval trade routes as this intricate web, carrying not just goods, but actual culture and ideas to completely different corners of the world.
And the threads of that connection, they continue to influence us today. We're still benefiting from those medieval innovations, whether we realize it or not.
Okay, I have to ask, how do these medieval advancements still impact us in the 21st century? It seems like such a long time ago.
Look around. Modern shipbuilding, it still relies on many of the fundamental principles developed way back then, especially when it comes to, like, hull design and stability.
Even today.
Absolutely. And think about those navigational tools we take for granted, like GPS. They're built upon centuries of accumulated knowledge, including those celestial navigation techniques perfected by, medieval sailors using the stars.
It's kind of humbling, to think that even in our high-tech world, we're still standing on the shoulders of those medieval shipbuilders and explorers. They were true visionaries.
They were, and it's not just about the technology itself, it's about their mindset, their spirit of innovation, their willingness to learn from other cultures.
It's easy to forget that the medieval period wasn't just about knights and castles. It was a time of incredible intellectual and technological advancement, especially in the maritime world. Makes you wonder what else we've overlooked.
Right. It's a good reminder that progress is often, incremental, building upon the achievements of those who came before us. And sometimes, the most important breakthroughs, they come from the most unexpected sources.
This makes me think about those giant Chinese junks you mentioned earlier. 200 feet long. It's hard to even fathom the scale of those ships. They were clearly in a league of their own.
It really is mind-boggling. Those massive junks, they weren't just impressive feats of engineering. They were symbols of China's maritime power, their global ambition.
But what ultimately happened to those grand expeditions? Why did China's maritime dominance just, fade? It seems like they had such a head start.
That's a question that historians still debate today. There are a lot of theories. Some suggest that internal political shifts, changing priorities in China, those things led to a decline in their maritime ambitions.
So, they just shifted their focus away from the sea.
In a way, yes. Others point to the cost, the immense logistical challenges of maintaining such vast fleets over such long distances.
It's like they hit the pause button on globalization, right when they were poised to, take the lead. What a turning point in history.
It definitely makes you think about the what-ifs of history. What if those Chinese expeditions had continued? How might that have shaped, globalization and the world we live in today?
It's tempting to imagine a world where Chinese influence was even more widespread, isn't it?
It is. And it's a reminder that history, it isn't predetermined. Seemingly small decisions, events, they can have ripple effects for centuries.
So looking ahead to the future of, our oceans, what are some of the key lessons we can take away from those medieval seafarers? They face their own challenges, I'm sure, but nothing like the global issues we're dealing with today.
Their stories teach us the importance of embracing innovation, fostering collaboration, adapting to, changing circumstances.
And those are definitely qualities we need now more than ever.
Absolutely. Climate change, pollution, resource management. These problems are far bigger than anything those medieval sailors could have imagined. But their approaches, their mindset, those things can still guide us.
Okay, so how do those, medieval lessons actually translate to the 21st century? How do we put those principles into action?
Well, take sustainability, for example. Modern shipbuilding, it's increasingly focused on reducing emissions, minimizing environmental impact.
It's like they were forced to be sustainable back then, right? They couldn't just pop down to the marine supply store for a new engine.
Exactly. They had to innovate, experiment with different designs and materials, work within the constraints of their environment. And those lessons, they're incredibly relevant today as we try to create a more sustainable maritime industry.
So it's not just about copying their specific techniques. It's more about adopting their, mindset.
Precisely. That spirit of resourcefulness, adaptability.
What about collaboration? How does that fit into all of this?
Remember those cultural exchanges we talked about earlier? The sharing of ideas and technologies between, Europe and Asia? That collaborative spirit, it was essential to their progress. They weren't afraid to learn from each other, to adopt and adapt the best ideas.
It's like they understood that the best solutions, they often come from a mix of different perspectives and approaches. That's something we need more of today, right? Breaking down those silos, sharing knowledge, working together to find solutions to these global challenges.
Absolutely. The challenges facing the modern maritime industry are complex, interconnected. No one nation or company can solve them alone. We need that same spirit of openness and collaboration.
It's amazing to think about how we've come full circle. Those medieval mariners, they were pioneers of globalization, not just in terms of, trade and exploration, but also in terms of cross-cultural collaboration, and knowledge sharing. That's a legacy worth preserving.
It is. They laid the groundwork for a more interconnected world, and their legacy, it continues to inspire us today.
You know, it's ironic. We often think of the medieval period as like a time of isolation and conflict. But when it comes to the maritime world, it was actually a period of remarkable interconnectedness and cultural exchange.
It's true. It's a reminder that history is often more nuanced and complex than we realize, and that sometimes the most valuable lessons come from the most unexpected places.
Speaking of unexpected places, we've talked a lot about the technological innovations of medieval seafaring.
Yeah.
But what about the human side of things? What was it actually like to be a sailor in that era?
That's a great question, and one that we often overlook. Life at sea in the medieval period, it was incredibly challenging and dangerous. These sailors faced storms, disease, piracy, the constant uncertainty of the open ocean.
Wow. It's hard to imagine the courage
Yeah.
and resilience it must have taken to embark on those voyages, knowing the risks involved. They were true adventurers.
They were, and yet they do it. They ventured into the unknown, driven by, a thirst for adventure, a desire for trade, a yearning to connect with different cultures.
Their stories are a testament to the human spirit of exploration, the enduring power of curiosity.
Indeed. And their legacy, it lives on in the countless ways we continue to explore, connect, and navigate our world today.
Okay, so we've explored the technological innovations, the cultural exchanges, and even the human stories behind medieval seafaring. But there's one more piece of the puzzle I'm curious about, the cultural impact. How did those medieval voyages shape the way we see the world, even today? It seems like they've woven themselves into our collective imagination somehow.
That's a fascinating question, one that takes us beyond just ships and navigation into the realm of art, literature, the cultural imagination. It's about how these voyages captured the human spirit and shaped the stories we tell ourselves.
So how did those medieval voyages actually influence our cultural landscape? Give me some concrete examples.
Well, think about the countless stories, myths, and legends that have emerged from the sea, from Homer's Odyssey to, the tales of Sinbad the Sailor. The ocean has always been this source of fascination, inspiration for storytellers.
It's true. Those stories, they really capture our imaginations.
Yeah.
They transport us to distant lands, introduce us to fascinating characters. They make us want to set sail ourselves.
Exactly. And many of those stories, they have their roots in the real-life experiences of medieval seafarers. Their voyages provided the raw material for tales of adventure, danger, and cultural encounters.
It's like those voyages, they planted these seeds in the human imagination, and those seeds have continued to grow and blossom over the centuries.
Precisely. And it's not just stories, right? Think about the visual arts. Maritime themes, they're everywhere. In paintings, sculptures, even architecture.
You're right. From those majestic ships like Renaissance paintings to the intricate nautical motifs on grand cathedrals, the sea has definitely left its mark on our visual culture.
And that influence extends to music, fashion, even language. The maritime world has permeated our culture in countless ways.
It's like those medieval voyages didn't just expand the map of the world. They also expanded the map of the human imagination. And we're still exploring that uncharted territory even today.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And that legacy, it continues to this day. We're still drawn to stories of exploration, adventure. We still find beauty and inspiration in the vastness of the ocean.
And our fascination with the sea, that sense of wonder and awe, it can be traced back in part to those intrepid medieval mariners who dared to venture beyond the known world. They opened our eyes to a world of possibilities.
Indeed. They opened up new horizons, not just geographically, but also culturally, imaginatively. And their legacy continues to shape the way we see ourselves and our place in the world.
It's amazing how a deep dive into, the technological innovations of medieval seafaring can lead us to such profound reflections on the human spirit, our relationship with the ocean, the enduring power of cultural exchange.
It's a testament to the interconnectedness of history, technology, and culture. And it underscores the importance of approaching the past with a sense of curiosity, a willingness to explore unexpected connections.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the key takeaway for our listeners? What's the one thing you hope they'll remember about this exploration of, medieval maritime innovation?
I think the most important message is this. The medieval period, it was a time of extraordinary maritime innovation, cultural exchange, human endeavor.
And those achievements, they continue to resonate with us today, offering valuable lessons for navigating the challenges of the 21st century.
Precisely. By studying the past, we can gain a deeper understanding of ourselves and our place in the world. And we can find inspiration, guidance, for creating a more sustainable and interconnected future.
And sometimes the most valuable lessons come from the most unexpected sources, like those intrepid medieval mariners who dared to sail beyond the horizon and connect the world through their ingenuity and courage. They set an example for us all.
Indeed, their legacy continues to sail with us.
Okay, so we've really gone deep on this journey into medieval maritime history. From European caravels to Chinese junks, it's amazing to see how those innovations set the stage for the modern world.
And we've explored how those lessons of adaptability, collaboration, and that constant drive to innovate are even more relevant today as we face some pretty big challenges on the seas.
Absolutely. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with something to chew on, a thought-provoking question that might spark their own explorations.
I love that a little mental flotsam and jetsam to take with them on their journey.
Exactly. So here it is. As we face new challenges on the seas, from climate change to overfishing and everything in between, what can we learn from that collaborative spirit and drive to innovate that we saw in those medieval seafarers?
It really challenges us to think about how we can apply those historical lessons to the incredibly complex problems facing our oceans today. We can't just rely on the same old solutions.
Because, let's be honest, the ocean is in trouble. Pollution, overfishing, rising sea levels, these are global issues that demand global solutions.
And just like those medieval mariners who had to navigate uncharted waters and overcome unpredictable obstacles, we need to embrace a spirit of ingenuity, resilience, and collaboration to chart a sustainable course for the future. We have to think outside the box and work together.
It all comes back to recognizing that we're all interconnected. The health of our oceans is directly tied to our own well-being. We can't ignore that connection.
And just as those medieval seafarers connected the world through trade and cultural exchange, we need to find new ways to connect and collaborate to protect our shared maritime heritage. It's about sharing knowledge and resources, not just competing for them.
So, as we set sail into the future, let's remember the lessons of those who came before us. Let's embrace the spirit of innovation, the power of collaboration, and that enduring human connection to the sea that has driven us for centuries.
Because the ocean isn't just a body of water. It's a reflection of ourselves, our history, and our shared destiny. It's a mirror to humanity.
And it's up to us to navigate those waters wisely, for the sake of our planet and for generations to come. No pressure, writer.
Well, there you have it, a whirlwind tour through the world of medieval maritime innovation and its surprisingly relevant lessons for today. Thanks for diving in with us.
And until next time, keep exploring.
Okay, so we've really gone deep on this journey into medieval maritime history, from European caravels to Chinese junks, and it's amazing to see how, those innovations set the stage for the modern world. And we've explored how those lessons of adaptability, collaboration, and that constant drive to innovate are even more relevant today, as we face some pretty big challenges on the seas.
Absolutely. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with something to chew on, a thought-provoking question that might spark their own explorations.
I love that. A little mental flotsam and jetsam to take with them on their journey.
Exactly. So here it is. As we face new challenges on the seas, from climate change to overfishing and everything in between, what can we learn from that collaborative spirit and drive to innovate that we saw in those medieval seafarers?
It really challenges us, doesn't it, to think about how we can apply those historical lessons to the, incredibly complex problems facing our oceans today. We can't just rely on the same old solutions.
Because, let's be honest, the ocean is in trouble. Pollution, overfishing, rising sea levels. These are global issues that demand global solutions.
And just like those medieval mariners, they had to navigate uncharted waters, overcome unpredictable obstacles, right? We need to embrace that same spirit, ingenuity, resilience, and collaboration to chart a sustainable course for the future. We have to think outside the box and work together.
It all comes back to recognizing that we're all interconnected, doesn't it? The health of our oceans. It's directly tied to our own well-being. We can't ignore that connection.
And just as those medieval seafarers connected the world through trade and cultural exchange, we need to find new ways to connect and collaborate to protect our shared maritime heritage. It's about sharing knowledge and resources, not just competing for them.
So as we set sail into the future, let's remember the lessons of those who came before us. Let's embrace the spirit of innovation, the power of collaboration, and that enduring human connection to the sea. That has driven us for centuries.
Because the ocean, it isn't just a body of water. It's a reflection of ourselves, our history, and our shared destiny.
And it's up to us to navigate those waters wisely, right? For the sake of our planet and for generations to come.
No pressure. Well, there you have it. A whirlwind tour through the world of medieval maritime innovation. And its surprisingly relevant lessons for today. Thanks for diving in with us.
And until next time, keep exploring. Welcome to another deep dive. You know, I'm always excited to see what topics y'all bring to the table, and this one's a real doozy. This week, we're diving headfirst into the Age of Discovery. You sent in a chapter about this era, which, you know, fair warning to everyone listening, means we're about to set sail on a wild ride through history, geography, politics, and maybe even a little bit of astronomy. Buckle up.
Sounds like quite the voyage.
Oh, absolutely. Because we're talking about a period of intense exploration, driven by this incredible thirst for new trade routes, new lands. Maritime innovation was going through the roof, and there were some pretty incredible characters making waves. Did you know, for instance, that there's this ship called a caravel that basically changed the game?
Really?
Yeah. And how about the fact that sailors back then used the stars, not just compasses, to navigate across, like, vast oceans?
It's amazing what they accomplished with the technology they had.
It really is, right? But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's start with the basics. Why were Europeans so gung-ho about exploring in the first place?
Well, think about it. They were driven by this powerful cocktail of motivations. First, there was the desire for wealth. They wanted to find new trade routes to the east. Places like India and China to get their hands on spices, silks, gold, all that good stuff. Imagine the riches.
Yeah, who doesn't love a little spice and a little gold, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And then there was this religious zeal. Spreading Christianity was a major driving force, too. Converting new populations, expanding the reach of the church, all that.
Right. Plus, I'm sure a healthy dose of good old-fashioned competition didn't hurt either.
Oh, absolutely. The European powers were all vying for dominance. They wanted to plant their flags in new lands and claim bragging rights. Individual explorers were also driven by this quest for fame and glory, to go down in history as the first to discover this or that.
It's like the ultimate adventure, right? With some serious stakes. But let's be honest, none of this would have been possible without some serious advancements in, how they got around.
Yeah.
Like ships. What can you tell us about the caravel?
Oh, the caravel was a game changer, for sure. This was a small, super maneuverable ship with these triangular sails called lateen sails. And these lateen sails were revolutionary because they allowed the ships to sail against the wind, which had never really been done before.
So it wasn't just about being faster or bigger. It was about, being able to go wherever they wanted.
Exactly. It gave them so much more control. They could hug coastlines more easily. They could explore rivers and inlets, venture further out to sea. It really opened up a whole new world of exploration.
And then you mentioned another type of ship too, right?
A galleon.
Galleon, that's the one.
The galleon came on the scene a bit later, and it was a whole different beast. Much larger, more heavily armed. While it played a big role in trade, transporting all those precious goods back and forth, it also became pretty important in naval warfare, which unfortunately was heating up around that time.
So from exploration vessel to warship.
In a way, yeah. It was a symbol of both the wealth and the conflict that came with this era of discovery.
I see. So we've got these amazing ships, but how did they actually find their way across vast oceans? Was every sailor back then like a master astronomer or something?
Well, they definitely needed a good grasp of celestial navigation. They had some pretty incredible tools at their disposal, too. There was the compass, of course, for determining direction. But then there was this instrument called an astrolabe.
What?
An astrolabe. It sounds complicated, but it was basically this beautifully intricate device they would use to measure the angle of the sun or stars. And using that angle, they could calculate their latitude, their position north or south of the equator.
But they were literally looking to the heavens to figure out where they were on Earth.
Yeah.
That's wild.
It really is. And then there was another tool, a simpler one actually, called a kamal. It was favored by Arab sailors. Imagine this small wooden board with a knotted string. They'd hold the string in their teeth and align the board with a specific star, and that would tell them their latitude. Pretty ingenious for such a simple device, right? Simple, but effective. It's amazing what they can do with those tools. But what about maps? I mean, those old maps look more like, rough sketches than actual maps. Talk about scary. Did they even have decent maps back then?
Well, map making or cartography was also going through a major revolution during this era. Early explorers often relied on maps from ancient Greece, Ptolemy's maps.
Ancient Greece.
Yeah. So, those maps were centuries old and not exactly up to date. And as they explored more, they started realizing just how inaccurate those maps were.
So how did they improve things?
Sailors began meticulously recording their observations. They created what were called portalon charts, which were super detailed and focused on coastlines, harbors, and dangers. They used compass lines and rum lines to represent distances and directions accurately. This was a game changer for navigation.
So they were basically building their maps as they went, based on what they saw.
Exactly. That's why these charts were so valuable. They were constantly being refined and updated, becoming more and more accurate over time. Okay, so we've got the ships, the navigation, and the maps all figured out. But let's not forget about the stars of the show, the explorers themselves. We could spend hours talking about all the amazing individuals who sailed the seas during this time. But for now, let's focus on two big names: Prince Henry the Navigator of Portugal and Vasco da Gama.
Great choices. They really represent the ambition and innovation of this era.
So tell me about Prince Henry. Was he actually out there exploring himself?
Actually, Prince Henry wasn't an explorer in the traditional sense. He was more of a visionary, a sponsor, a driving force behind exploration. He established a school of navigation in Portugal, brought together the best map makers, shipbuilders, sailors, everyone. And he sponsored a ton of expeditions down the coast of Africa.
So he was like the brains behind the operation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He was obsessed with pushing the boundaries of the known world and establishing Portugal as a major player in maritime exploration. He really laid the groundwork for everything that followed.
Okay, so Prince Henry sets the stage, and then comes Vasco da Gama, right? He was the one who finally cracked the code to reaching India by sea.
That's right. Da Gama's voyage to India in 1498 was monumental. Imagine navigating around the treacherous Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa. He was the first European to do it, and that opened up a direct sea route to the legendary spice markets of the East.
And that was a really big deal, wasn't it? I mean, for Europe, for the world.
Absolutely. Think about it. They could finally bypass those traditional land routes which were controlled by Arab and Venetian merchants. This gave European powers direct access to those lucrative Eastern markets. It was a major shift in economic power, a game changer for global trade.
Wow, that's incredible to think about. But as we know, every story has two sides. We can't talk about the Age of Discovery without acknowledging the darker side of things.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Alongside the incredible achievements, there were also tragic consequences. The establishment of these new trade routes, while exciting for many, also led to exploitation on a massive scale.
You're talking about the slave trade, right?
Yeah. The transatlantic slave trade emerged during this era, with millions of Africans forcibly taken from their homes and transported to the Americas as slave labor. It was a brutal, dehumanizing system that fueled the growth of colonial economies but came at a horrific cost.
It's a sobering reminder that progress often comes at a steep price, and that even the most celebrated periods in history have their dark chapters.
Exactly. It's important to remember those who suffered and lost their lives as a result of these voyages.
Well, thank you for taking us on this incredible journey through the Age of Discovery. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the motivations for exploration to the advancements in ship design and navigation, the remarkable voyages of explorers like Prince Henry and Vasco da Gama, and the impact of these events on the world, both good and bad. It's a complex legacy, to say the least.
A legacy that continues to shape our world today.
And that brings us to our final thought for all of you listening. Knowing what we know now about the complexities of this era, the innovations, the discoveries, the ambitions, and the devastating consequences, how do you view the Age of Discovery? Was it ultimately a force for progress, or did its darker aspects outweigh its achievements? Something to ponder, isn't it? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time.
Ahoy there, listeners! Ready to set sail on a deep dive into the heart of 18th century maritime history.
Absolutely. I'm ready to chart a course through these fascinating sources.
We've got charts and logs, ship blueprints, and even some personal accounts from sailors. A real treasure trove.
And together, they tell a story of a world in transformation. Think global trade networks, revolutionary ship designs, and epic naval battles.
It's a world that shaped the way we live today, from the goods we buy to the very idea of a globalized world.
Exactly. When we think about 18th century ships, we often picture those majestic, tall ships with their billowing sails.
Right, like something out of a pirate movie.
But there's so much more to it than meets the eye. I mean, those designs, they were driven by hard economic realities.
Especially for merchant ships, right? I mean, our sources really highlighted the focus on efficiency and profit.
Oh, absolutely. Take the ship to square rigging, for instance.
So explain that one. What's square rigging?
Well, it's a type of sail arrangement that, while not as maneuverable as other rigging styles, allowed ships to carry significantly more cargo.
Makes sense. More cargo means more profit. All right.
Precisely. It was all about maximizing those returns on goods like sugar, tobacco, and textiles. Those were the hot commodities of the day.
And to think, something as seemingly simple as changing the sails could have such a huge impact on global trade.
It's a great example of how technological innovation can ripple outwards, shaping economies and even cultures.
Absolutely. And of course, all those precious goods had to be protected, which brings us to another fascinating aspect. The warships.
Ah, yes, the behemoths of the sea, the ships of the line.
Those were those massive warships, right? With rows and rows of cannons.
Exactly. They were the backbone of naval power, and they were designed to slug it out in massive fleet engagements.
Can you imagine being on board one of those ships during a battle?
It would have been absolutely terrifying. The thunderous roar of cannons, the splintering of wood, the cries of the wounded.
It must have been a whole other world out there. Our sources do paint a pretty vivid picture of just how brutal naval warfare was in the 18th century.
It was a fight for control of the seas, for dominance in trade and global influence. And it wasn't just about brute force either.
Right. There was also a lot of clever strategizing going on. New types of ships, like frigates and sloops of war, were introduced.
Each with its own strengths and weaknesses, leading to increasingly complex tactics and naval maneuvers.
All of this, of course, wouldn't have been possible without some major advancements in navigation.
Yes, the art of finding your way across vast oceans. That was a game changer.
I mean, imagine setting sail without GPS or even a reliable map. It's mind-boggling.
Exactly. Before the 18th century, navigation relied heavily on celestial observation and, frankly, a lot of guesswork.
Talk about stressful.
Right. But then we see the refinement of instruments like the sextant.
Which helped determine latitude more accurately, I think.
Precisely. Suddenly, voyages became more predictable and sailors could venture farther with greater confidence.
And that paved the way for explorations like, well, Captain James Cook's voyages.
Oh, absolutely. Cook's expeditions to the Pacific relied heavily on these new tools, charting unknown territories and fundamentally changing European understanding of the world.
It really makes you appreciate how these seemingly small technological advancements could have such massive ripple effects.
It's a domino effect, really. Better navigation meant more daring voyages, which in turn led to expanded trade routes and the discovery of new lands.
And speaking of trade, the 18th century saw an absolute explosion in global trade networks, right?
It was an era of unprecedented interconnectedness, with ships carrying goods across oceans like never before.
I think the most well-known example from our sources was the transatlantic trade.
The infamous triangle trade, a complex web of exchange between Europe, Africa, and the Americas.
It's a dark chapter in history, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But it really highlights how maritime trade could be both a source of great wealth and immense suffering.
It's a nuanced legacy, that's for sure. We had European manufactured goods flowing to Africa, then enslaved Africans being transported to the Americas under horrific conditions.
And from the Americas, it was raw materials like sugar and cotton heading back to Europe.
A complex system that profoundly impacted economies, societies, and cultures on all three continents.
Definitely a lot to unpack there. And it wasn't just the Atlantic that was seeing this surge in activity.
Oh no, European ambitions extended far beyond that. The East, with its exotic spices, tea, and porcelain, held an irresistible allure.
And that led to the rise of these powerful maritime companies, right? Like the East India Company.
Absolutely. These were massive organizations, often with their own private armies, that essentially acted as extensions of their governments.
They were shaping empires, controlling vast trading networks.
And sometimes engaging in practices that, looking back, were clearly exploitative. It was a time of tremendous opportunity, but also great moral complexity.
And as trade routes expanded and the seas became more crowded, it's not surprising that the need for some kind of international legal framework arose.
Exactly. You can't have all these ships from different nations crisscrossing the globe without some rules of the road.
So that's where maritime law comes in, right?
Precisely. This period saw the emergence of concepts like freedom of the seas, the right of neutral ships to trade freely, even during wartime.
Makes sense. And I bet it got pretty complicated trying to enforce that.
Oh, absolutely. There were attempts to codify rules of naval engagement, but in the heat of battle, things often got messy. And then, of course, you had the wild card, the pirates.
Ah, yes, the swashbuckling rogues of the high seas. Is it true, though? Was the 18th century really the golden age of piracy?
Well, it certainly was a time when piracy flourished. But the romanticized image we often have, from movies and books, doesn't always capture the full picture.
Yeah, I bet the reality was a lot less glamorous.
For sure, piracy was often born out of desperation, poverty, or political upheaval. And the life of a pirate was brutal and short, full of danger and violence.
So Blackbeard and his ilk, they were real. But their stories were probably a lot more grim than the legends suggest.
Absolutely. While their exploits were certainly daring and their impact on maritime trade significant, we shouldn't forget the darker side of their story.
It's a good reminder that history is rarely black and white. Speaking of a tough life, let's not forget the ordinary sailors who kept those ships running.
Oh, their lives were incredibly demanding. Imagine spending months, even years, crammed into a tiny, often filthy space.
Yeah, our sources really highlighted the cramped quarters, the strict hierarchies, the constant threat of disease.
And don't forget the storms, the battles, the sheer physical labor involved in sailing a ship back then. It was a life of hardship, for sure.
But amidst all that hardship, I imagine there was also a strong sense of camaraderie.
Absolutely. Those sailors had to rely on each other for survival. They faced danger together, shared their meager rations, and found ways to entertain themselves during long voyages.
A real band of brothers, eh? And while they were out there sailing the world, they were also shaping it. All that maritime activity had to have a huge impact on the places they visited.
Oh, for sure. Port cities became these bustling hubs of global commerce, vibrant melting pots of cultures and ideas.
I can almost picture it, the waterfront teeming with sailors, merchants, and goods from all corners of the globe.
It was a time of tremendous growth and opportunity for these coastal communities. But of course, with all that activity came challenges as well.
I bet. Overcrowding, crime, the spread of diseases.
Exactly. It's important to remember that the growth of maritime trade and exploration wasn't always a purely positive thing. It had its downsides, too.
It's a reminder that even in times of great progress, there are always winners and losers.
And unintended consequences that we have to grapple with.
Well, listeners, it seems we've navigated our way through a pretty fascinating chapter of history.
We've explored the technological marvels, the economic forces, the human stories that shaped the 18th century seas.
We've seen how advancements in ship design, navigation, and global trade really connected the world like never before.
And laid the groundwork for our modern, interconnected world. It's incredible to think about how those changes from centuries ago continue to impact us today.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up our deep dive, I want to leave you with a thought. Take a look around you at the things you use, the food you eat, even the clothes you wear.
Chances are, many of those things have a story that stretches back to the 18th century seas, a reminder of the enduring legacy of this pivotal era in maritime history.
Fair winds and following seas, listeners. Until next time. All right, diving in. This time, we're tackling 19th century maritime history, and let me tell you, the research you sent over is amazing. It's like ships and the sea, but way more than just cool boats, right?
You got it. The 1800s, that's where the modern world of ships and the sea really starts taking shape.
Yeah, from your research, it seems like it's not just about ships themselves. It's about how everything maritime, well, kind of changed everything, like the whole world, didn't it?
Absolutely. It's a story of how the world interacted, trade, wars, even cultures, all because of what was going on out at sea.
Okay, so let's break this down. You sent over some really cool stuff about how ships were designed back then. What were the big changes they were making for, like, merchant ships and those big warships?
So for merchant ships, it was all about efficiency. You want to carry more stuff faster and cheaper, right? Shipbuilders, they were always trying new hull designs, less drag, more space for cargo. That's the name of the game. And actually, that Ronson ship excavation you sent, perfect example.
Oh, yeah, that one was fascinating. What exactly did they learn from that dig?
Okay, so the Ronson ship, it was a big one. 3 masts, probably sailing those colonial trade routes. But what's really cool, they found all this advanced stuff, like rigging and cargo storage. They had these separate compartments, really clever, so they could carry all kinds of goods and keep them from going bad.
So it wasn't just making ships bigger, it was like making them smarter, too.
Exactly. Now, for warships, things were getting pretty intense. We're talking ships of the line here. These huge warships built to blast each other to bits.
Sounds intense. What made them so different from the older warships?
Okay, picture this. These ships were basically floating fortresses. They had rows and rows of cannons, sometimes over 100. So you needed a super strong hull, right? I mean, building a wooden ship that can handle all that firepower, that's some serious engineering.
It's mind-blowing. But with these amazing new ships, how did they navigate those huge oceans?
Yeah.
Your research had some interesting stuff about navigation too, right?
Oh yeah, navigation was getting a major upgrade. Think sextants for measuring those angles in the sky, and chronometers, these super accurate clocks for figuring out longitude. They got so much more reliable.
The chronometer, yeah, I remember that from the research. It was like a total game changer, wasn't it?
Totally. Before accurate chronometers, figuring out longitude was a nightmare. Ships could be hundreds of miles off course, delays, lost cargo, even shipwrecks. But the chronometer, better maps, all those astronomical tables, it made navigating way more accurate. The world was open for exploration and trade like never before.
Which brings us to those global trade routes, right? You mentioned the transatlantic and Asian routes specifically. What's the deal with those?
All right, so the transatlantic, it's this massive network connecting Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Think manufactured goods, textiles, and sadly enslaved people. The impact on both sides of the Atlantic was huge.
Yeah, that's a pretty heavy legacy. What about trade with Asia? That was booming too, right?
You bet. Europeans, they couldn't get enough of those Asian luxury goods, like tea, silk, spices. Huge maritime companies popped up, some still around today, like that East India Company. They had their hands in everything, controlled so much trade, tons of power, economic and political.
Imagine the scale of those companies back then. It's incredible how much they shaped things. But with all this trade and wealth, you need some rules, right? You sent over stuff of maritime law, which sounds, well, important, but maybe not as exciting as pirates.
True, but you can't have global trade without rules. As trade grew, so did the need for laws about international waters. Think collisions at sea, how sailors were treated. This was all happening when mercantilism was big, that idea that nations need to protect their own ships and trade.
So, little cooperation, little competition. But speaking of competition, we got to talk pirates. What was piracy like in the 19th century?
Yeah, pirates, everyone loves a good pirate story.
Mm-hmm.
In the early 1800s, it was a real problem. There were famous pirates like Jean Lafitte in the Gulf of Mexico, Qing Shi in the South China Sea. They were disrupting trade left and right. But as the century went on, those big navies got better at stopping them.
So, good stories, but thankfully, not as many pirates running around. I want to shift gears for a second, talk about the people on these ships. What was life really like for a sailor back then?
It was tough, man. Long voyages, cramped quarters, storms all the time, and disease was a constant worry. And discipline, especially on warships, it was brutal. There are these old diaries from sailors. They talk about punishments for even little things. But there was also a lot of camaraderie, the excitement of exploring new places. And for those merchant sailors, seeing all these different cultures in port cities.
And those port cities, they were changing too, weren't they? You mentioned how they became way more than just places to load and unload cargo.
Oh yeah, port cities, they were booming. Centers of global trade, all these cultures mixing. Think London, New York, Singapore, they grew like crazy. Full of merchants, sailors, immigrants, all kinds of characters. They were truly global cities.
So wrapping things up, it's clear those 19th century ships, they did more than just sail around. They changed the world. I mean, global trade, international law, so much of what we have today started back then. But here's a final thought for you. Knowing how connected the world was becoming back then, how do you think those 19th century ships and the sea, how do you think they still affect us today?
That's a great question. That 19th century maritime world, it really set the stage for today's globalized world. And as we deal with the challenges and the opportunities of this super connected world, while understanding that history, those roots, it can help us figure out how to navigate the future.
All right, so ever feel like history is just like this giant staring contest?
Yeah.
Well, today we're zooming in on probably one of the most intense standoffs ever, right?
Yeah.
The Cold War.
Absolutely.
But we're going deeper than just like tanks and missiles.
Yeah.
We're going like deep beneath the surface.
Okay.
And exploring how all this played out on the high seas.
All right. Sounds good. I like it. So, the Cold War at sea, huh?
Yep. The Cold War at sea. I'm excited for this one.
Well, what's I think super fascinating is how the Cold War, it totally redefined what naval power actually meant.
I mean, yeah, it's not like the age of sail anymore.
Right, exactly. Forget those, massive battleships just like slugging it out. The ocean basically turned into this giant chessboard.
Okay, I like that. A chessboard.
Yeah, so you have these submarines, aircraft carriers, even trade routes, all becoming these like pawns in a global power struggle.
So, okay, we know the U.S. and the Soviet Union were like totally locked in this crazy ideological battle.
Yeah.
But like, how did that actually translate into like this whole naval arms race thing? Did they just like wake up one morning and say, hey, let's build a ton of fancy boats?
Haha, not exactly. I mean, both sides quickly realized that if you want to project power across the entire globe, you need a strong navy.
Okay, makes sense.
And the real game changer, technology.
Ooh, technology.
Yeah, take, for example, nuclear submarines.
Hmm.
The Soviets, they actually launched the first nuclear sub, get this, back in 1958.
Wow, 58, that's pretty early.
Right, and this wasn't just like some cool tech thing. This fundamentally shifted the balance of power. Imagine like these underwater fortresses capable of launching a nuclear attack from anywhere in the world, and they're just like lurking silently under the waves.
I mean, it's a chilling thought, right? Like these things are just like hiding in the depths, ready to launch a nuke. It makes you wonder how close we actually came to,
Disaster.
yeah, disaster. And it wasn't just subs, was it?
Oh, no. Aircraft carriers, those
Yeah.
got a major upgrade as well.
I bet.
They became these like mobile air bases able to project force way beyond a country's borders.
Okay, so they're like these floating fortresses.
Exactly.
Wow.
For instance, like when they introduced angled flight decks in the 1950s.
Yeah.
That was huge. Allowed for like much safer and more efficient aircraft operations. Just boosted their offensive capabilities significantly.
So it's like they could launch even more planes, even faster.
Exactly. And then on top of all that, you had missiles.
Oh, yeah, the missiles.
Right, which could be launched from both ships and subs.
Adding a whole nother layer of, well, danger to all this.
Absolutely. Made things a lot more complex.
Which, I mean, it's impressive and all these advancements.
Yeah.
But it also kind of makes you think, didn't this make the world a much, much more dangerous place?
I mean, yeah.
Like, weren't people just terrified of, well, total annihilation?
You're absolutely right. The stakes were unbelievably high.
Yeah.
And that's actually where the whole concept of mutually assured destruction, or MAD, comes in.
Okay, maybe.
Right, MA. It was terrifying. But oddly enough, it was also a kind of stabilizing force.
I mean, that's a weird paradox.
It is.
That something so terrifying can also keep things, like, stable.
Yeah, totally. Like, the Cuban Missile Crisis
Yeah.
back in '62.
Oh, yeah.
That really brought this whole chilling reality to the forefront. They had Soviet submarines armed with nuclear torpedoes deployed near Cuba.
Wow.
Added like this whole other layer of tension to an already super tense situation. Luckily, cooler heads prevailed. But, I mean, the world was holding its breath as these superpowers just stared each other down, fully aware of what could happen if things went too far.
So, I mean, it was a giant game of chicken, basically,
Yeah.
but with the highest stakes imaginable.
Exactly.
But within that, like, what were some of the actual strategies they used?
Well, the U.S., they usually focused on what's called sea control.
Okay, sea control.
Yeah, which basically meant dominating key areas, like the North Atlantic.
So they wanted to control the seas.
Control, exactly. The Soviets, though, they had a different approach. They were all about sea denial.
Okay, so what's that mean?
Their goal was to disrupt those lines of communication and power projection that the U.S. relied on.
So basically, they were trying to prevent the U.S. from controlling the seas.
Yep, pretty much. And all this resulted in a ton of strategic maneuvering, blockades, aggressive patrols, this constant game of cat and mouse on the open ocean.
It sounds like super intense.
Yeah, it was.
But wasn't the Soviet Navy also capable of, like, projecting power beyond its borders?
Yeah, definitely. They actually invested heavily in a blue water fleet specifically to challenge the U.S.'s dominance.
Wow.
Deployed their ships everywhere, the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, even the Caribbean, basically pushing boundaries and testing the West's resolve.
I weren't messing around.
Nope. And, this led to some, let's say, tense encounters. There were tons of close calls between U.S. and Soviet warships during the Cold War. It was this, like, high-stakes dance with each side trying to show who's boss without actually starting a war.
So we talked a lot about strategies and stuff, but this all sounds very theoretical. Like,
Yeah.
were there any real-world examples of these strategies actually in action?
Oh, tons. Take the Korean War, for instance.
Okay, the Korean War.
The U.S. Navy's ability to, like, totally control the seas was super instrumental in supporting the UN forces, and it actually ended up shaping the entire outcome of that war.
Interesting.
Really highlighted how important naval logistics and power projection are, especially in those limited war situations.
So even in a smaller conflict, sea power still matters a lot.
Absolutely. Or think about the Falklands War.
Okay.
The British Navy, they were facing like a way bigger Argentine force, but they still managed to take back those islands.
Wow.
Showed how strategically important long-range naval power projection can be, especially in like geographically challenging places.
So we've got these two superpowers, right?
Right.
Each with this like scary arsenal and their own goals. But like they weren't exactly going at it alone, right?
No, definitely not. The Cold War was also like the birth of these huge naval alliances. Each side wanted to, boost their strength by working together, doing exercises and things like that.
Makes sense. Safety in numbers.
Totally. So you had NATO in the West.
Right.
And the Warsaw Pact in the East. And these weren't just for show.
Yeah.
They represented like a huge shift in the global power balance. They developed joint doctrines, did combined exercises, even had integrated command structures. All of that really increased their capabilities.
So it wasn't just about like individual ships and subs.
Yeah.
It was about like this whole combined force.
Exactly.
But it wasn't just about military might either, was it?
Nope.
I mean, it seems like economics played a huge role in this too.
Absolutely. Controlling vital sea routes, those choke points, those became super critical.
Like what kind of choke points?
Well, think about the Strait of Malacca, for example, or the Suez Canal. Whoever controlled those could basically dictate the flow of all these goods and resources.
So like oil, food, all that.
Yeah, all of it, yeah. And they could basically cripple their opponent's economy if they wanted to.
So it's like this whole other kind of warfare.
Exactly. It was economic warfare. And we even saw things like, sanctions and blockades. Wasn't always about blowing things up.
It was about squeezing them.
Exactly.
So we've covered like a lot here. We talked about submarines, missiles, these kind of terrifying strategies, global alliances, and even economic warfare. Like, what does all this mean for us today? How does the Cold War at sea connect to like the world now?
That's the big question, right? I mean, the Cold War is over, but like all the stuff we learned about naval power, technology, global strategy, all that, it's still incredibly relevant.
I mean, things are heating up in a lot of places.
Exactly. And with tensions rising, understanding how all these things are connected is like more important than ever.
It really makes you think. The Cold War at sea was this like complex, often kind of terrifying chapter in history, but it also gives us these valuable insights into how power works, the role of technology, and just how important the oceans are. Something to think about, right?
Definitely something to think about.
As we try to navigate these, increasingly choppy waters of the 21st century. Well, I think that wraps up our deep dive for today.
Yeah, I think so.
Thanks for listening, everybody.
Thanks for having me.